now. So welcome to CISSP Exam Prep, 100 important topics. So just let's get some housekeeping and introductions out of the way, and we will get this show on the road. So just to keep things orderly, let's keep everything friendly and positive. No selling anything, no crypto offers or what have you. There will be a recording available for usually a few days after each of my sessions. It's actually more like a few months, generally speaking. I don't like to pull these down when I know people are using them. I'll send out a follow-up email within a few hours that will include a link to the video replay out on YouTube, as well as any resource links that I share in the process. And if you don't know who I am Pete Zerger. I am from 9 to 5 a cybersecurity strategist. I work largely in regulated industries. I'm a virtual chief information security officer for a regional bank. I develop content for a number of big names over the years that you're familiar with, including LinkedIn, and you may have found my content out on YouTube. Our agenda for this session, we're going to touch on 100 important exam topics across 8 domains in the next 3 hours. I'm going to sprinkle this with some exam prep strategy and resources as we go along. I'll hit some FAQs where it suits us, and I'll leave a little time for Q&A at the end if I can, but what I'd prefer to do is get through as many topics as I can with you, and I'm going to give you a way to send questions to me. So here's a form, a little web form where you can send me your questions. It has a place for attachment, so if you want to gather up multiple questions and send them to me, send those across. Let me have it. And we're going to work on the buddy SLA there, which means if you send those on a weekend, it might take me a couple of days to get back to you, but just know that I will get back to you. But throughout the next 3 hours, I'm going to call out significant elements of these key topics. I tried to tell you important things that are worth remembering, and where there are areas that you might unintentionally spend lots of time that you shouldn't, I'm going to warn you not to go too deep in certain other areas. I've found that I've gotten pretty good over the years at drilling down on high probability targets. In fact, I had a candidate here recently who had failed on their first try, found my content, and they said 98 of the 100 questions they received were straight out of my video series. So nobody's going to be perfect, but I do my best to make sure that that happens. So it looks like somebody has forwarded the meeting to an AI assistant, which is not allowed. So I'll be trying to block that incidentally, because I give you a video recording and a transcript. So the goals of this session, if we get down to business here, 100 topics or better in 180 minutes, key insights to support your exam prep, really talking about what you need to know for the exam, and really intending to be a big head start on exam prep. I'm going to touch on a significant number of items that would probably take you a couple of days to get through on your own if you were just trying to glean the insights that I'll share here in the next 3 hours. So the exam from 2021 to 2024 hasn't changed a great deal. There was a very minor shift in the domain weighting. So a non-event when it comes to your exam prep. It's exactly the same it was before. Let's talk about exam prep very briefly before we get into things here. So in terms of resources, I was originally going to create an all-new series, and the fact of the matter is the 2021 topics still apply, 100%. There are a handful of new topics that I cover in a 2024 addendum, so you are safe to use these two together for the 2024 exam. Folks are doing this all the time. The 2024 updates are minor. Everything from the last cycle still applies. I do call out where some technology updates have driven a need for certain topics to be updated, but not a great many of them, to be frank. And I do remember I had a candidate the day after the exam was refreshed, didn't have time to watch my 2024 addendum, and they just dealt with 2021 exam resources, walked in and passed the new exam. And lots of folks out there, if you have any worries about quality or focus of my content, you can go out and read comments until you're satisfied for sure. So in terms of resources, I like the official study guide from CIBEX because it's covering topics that I believe the official study guide knows are relevant. And in fact, they do call out the exam essentials at the end of every chapter. They have 1,000+ online practice questions. You want to make sure you're using the 10th edition. I would suggest in electronic format because in a physical book, you can certainly look up anything from the index, but not everything is going to be in the index. So having that electronic copy makes it searchable, but to each their own. So suit yourself. But I think the first book that I recommend folks get is that official study guide. There's a link to at least get you started. And with that, you have the practice test book, which is really meant to be an accompaniment. And it has several additional tests, but they're focused on each domain because the practice test book has one chapter for each domain of the exam, so it makes it easier to drill down on a per domain basis. Sadly, the engine for these online resources was changed, and you can no longer create bite-sized, smaller practice exams. You have to take a full, 100 question or better exam at one setting, although it will hold your place if you walk away and come back, but not ideal. So another book I would recommend today is CISSP The Last Mile. I released this book a couple of months ago at this point. It is over 450 pages of very clear, focused, and hopefully simple explanations covering every topic on the syllabus. In fact, the table of contents follows the exam syllabus item for item. More than 100 meaningful diagrams, reference tables, really trying to distill the what, why, and when that you'll need. And while the publisher platform said this should be a book I charge $30 for, it's available for as little as $9.99 USD. So very inexpensive, and the intent was precisely to make something worth much more than $10, but make it accessible to everyone. So if you'd like an additional reference, pick that one up with my compliments. Now, in terms of, let's call them optional resources, Pocket Prep, quantum exams, and exam flashcards are some nice to have items. So Pocket Prep is good for testing your knowledge of the exam topics, as well as to help you focus on weak areas. Pocket Prep works on just about any platform, and they allow you to do little bite-sized exams or exams that focus on your weak topics, etc. They're $22 a month, give or take. Now, quantum exams is a recently released product. They're a good simulation of real exam question format and language. They are not intending to teach you every topic you need to know for the exam. Their intent is to give you a good simulation of the real exam experience. And they do a pretty good job in aligning their question format and language with something similar that you'd see on the real thing. They do not yet have a CAT exam format, but they intend to have one in the coming months. I actually chat in the background with the author there, and he said they are working diligently. The exam prep flashcards come from yours truly and my team. There's about 1,350 for the CISSP exam, and you can use that on any device as well, so it works on mobile or desktop. But let's get into domain 1. So I'm going to go at a pretty brisk pace here. This is going to feel a bit like drinking from a fire hose, and that's my intent. So if you will bear with me, you're going to have some questions. Write your questions down. You have an easy way to get in touch with me. Always happy to take questions from anyone. I'll save some time at the end, and we'll run over if we have to answer some questions, and the rest I'll catch in email as they come to you. So let's start with number 1. If you just watch for those little yellow circles in the corners, you'll know where we are in terms of 1 to 100. We're going to start with the CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You want to know this one by heart and understand the importance and difference of each. Confidentiality means access controls to ensure that only authorized subjects can access objects, meaning only authorized people and systems can access resources. Integrity ensures that data or systems are not modified without authorization. And availability ensures that requests are serviced in a reasonable amount of time. Confidentiality and integrity mean very little without availability. Now, the 5 pillars of information security is a new reference. So confidentiality, integrity, availability, authenticity, and non-repudiation were all covered in a previous version of the exam. They simply were not referenced as the 5 pillars. So you will want to know what the 5 pillars are on exam day. If you see a question on that, it might well be a freebie. Number 3, knowing your priorities. So one of the elements of the exam mindset is understanding what your focus is, and that is one of a security leader. So your planning horizons in IT operations is pretty short. We're planning month to month and on a quarterly basis. Managers and directors are going to be a bit more tactical. They may be planning out their budget and their goals for the year. The executive management, the security leaders like the CISO, are going to be a bit more strategic in planning on up to a 5-year horizon, at least a 3-year horizon, but as long as 5 years in many cases. And that's really where you're going to be, is in those upper echelons, generally speaking. It's not a bad idea on the exam to think of yourself as a paid advisor who doesn't have keyboard access. And do remember, human safety is always your number one priority, and that's followed pretty quickly by business continuity and protecting profits while you're reducing liability and risk in a cost-effective way. So we're never going to do anything that we can't justify in terms of cost. Number 4, due diligence and due care. These two concepts go together. So due diligence, if we look at just the plain Jane definition, says practicing the activities that maintain the due care effort. Not terribly helpful. And due care is about doing what a reasonable person would do in a given situation. This is sometimes called the prudent man or prudent person rule. So let's look at it a bit differently. If I look at due diligence and due care together, due diligence largely happens before the decision. That's the planning, the research, the evaluation, and the due care is the work I do after I make that decision. Now, certainly this is a cyclical process. I'm going to come back and do due diligence on a recurring basis, but this gives you a bit of an idea that one is more about the planning and thinking and researching, and the other is more about the implementation, the doing, the maintenance. Now, to think about it another way, to just help you lock this in for the exam, due diligence, I'd say think before you act. And on the due care side, actions speak louder than words. Because if we do our due diligence and see that we have a critical security vulnerability related to our sensitive data, but we fail to execute due care, we failed to do the work, our executives may be legally liable in court. So I've got a memory device there, due diligence. You could say due detect. We're planning, we're evaluating. Due care, due correct. We have to do the work. If you'd like to get the long version, we do have the CISSP mindset video. It's right at half an hour. Well worth your time. That's really the full story. I've had multiple students walk out of the exam and say this was one of, if not the most important video that they watched or listened to. In fact, FB mentioned that he was watching this on the train to the exam, if memory serves. So definitely worth a half hour at your time. And I do tend to speak intentionally slowly, so you can, if you're English first language, you can typically crank me up to about 1.5x and still listen to me with no loss. All right, moving into numbers 5 and 6 here. We need to talk about security control frameworks and risk frameworks and the difference between the two. So security control frameworks are a prescriptive set of cybersecurity safeguards and best practices. They help in implementing the risk management strategy. Risk frameworks provide a structured approach to identifying, assessing, and prioritizing our risk. They provide the overarching structure for making risk-informed decisions. So we've got 1.3.4 and 1.9.9. And SOBSA, the Sherwood Applied Business Security Architecture, I called this out specifically because it was not mentioned in the 2021 version of the exam or in the official study guide. So that's net new. And I tend to think that new items that are mentioned are there for a reason. So you should know the basics of at least the purpose of SOBSA. It focuses on aligning security with business goals. It provides a structured method for designing, implementing, and managing. It can be used in conjunction with other risk frameworks and security control frameworks, and SOBSA kind of functions as both of those. So think of it this way. A risk framework really addresses the why. They guide strategic decision making about risk, and security control frameworks more address the how. They provide specific controls, and there are several frameworks of each type that you will need to learn for the exam. Most of those I've covered in the 2024 addendum, which is about 2.5 hours long, but you're going to want to drill down on both of those and understand which are which. All right, the NIST Risk Management Framework and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, numbers 8 and 9. So these are distinct and important for their own reasons. What I want you to remember here is that the NIST RMF is mandatory and intended for federal government agencies. So for the agencies in our federal government to which it applies, they have to use the RMF. The CSF, on the other hand, is purely optional. It was created for non-government entities, for commercial businesses. So it's optional. They both address cybersecurity risk management in a fashion. So another item we saw mentioned a bit more prominently in 2024 was FedRAMP, the Federal Risk and Authorization Management Program. It's a government-wide program. It provides a standardized approach to security assessment, authorization, monitoring. It's got some pretty simple goals, and that's to basically provide a way for government entities to accelerate their cloud adoption by providing a reusable approach for multiple agencies. So they can learn from one another and advance together. So the first agency can share their lessons learned with the second agency, but they capture all of their learnings and their recommendations into FedRAMP, that standardized approach for adopting and monitoring their cloud solutions. Two important standards you should be familiar with. ISO 27001, which was actually updated in 2022 to include cloud, and it guides organizations in identifying information assets, assessing their value and their risk, basically prioritizing their risk, and monitoring and measuring the efficacy of their information system management solutions. So it's really 27001 is the guidance. Now 27002 from ISO is about implementation. So 27002 is a companion document, and ISO 27002 is actually quite a bit larger than 27001. It provides basically best practices and control objectives, and it has focus areas throughout the information systems lifecycle. So throughout the management lifecycle, it really serves as a practical blueprint for organizations aiming to effectively safeguard their valuable assets. So ISO 27001 focuses more on the what and the why. It's the guidance. And 27002 is the how. But organizations can actually certify on ISO 27001 as an attestation that tells their customers that they are serious about securing their information systems. Now, I want to make sure just right out of the gate here that you understand these two concepts well, numbers 13 and 14. Privacy, which focuses on the rights of individuals to control their personal information, and confidentiality, which ensures that data is only accessed and disclosed to authorized individuals or entities. So to say it another way, privacy is about giving people ownership and control over their data. Confidentiality is about keeping data protected from unauthorized access. You want to make sure that these two are very clear in your mind. You're going to see in the questions you're asked on this exam that you may be able to pick out what the question is speaking to, if it's speaking to privacy or confidentiality or integrity or availability, and that's going to allow you to filter answers more effectively. So what is the source of our privacy rights? Well, in the U.S., it's the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Stored Communication Act of 1986 actually extends the Fourth Amendment into the electronic realm. And in the EU, it's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which protects subjects, people, and it applies to every company with customers in the EU, which means no matter where your company is located, if you serve customers in the EU, you are subject to GDPR regulations, considered the gold standard for privacy, really. You want to be familiar with the export controls around computer technology and encryption. This is restricted, so there are some rogue nations to which certain technology cannot be exported. The same is true of encryption. You'll also need to be familiar with a number of U.S. privacy laws. I've grouped some key laws here together in number 16. The full videos are going to go a bit deeper, but the fact of the matter is you really need to learn the laws at a high level. You don't need to get into the details. You don't need to read HIPAA. You don't need to read Gramm-Leach-Bliley. I would suggest remembering the acronyms that go with these in case the acronyms come up in the exam. In fact, Gramm-Leach-Bliley is GLBA as well. But understand their purpose. And there are some new privacy laws that came up in the 2024 exam. There's the Personal Information Protection Law in China and the Protection of Personal Information Act, which covers South Africa. Both of these are typical privacy laws. They address data collection, data security, usage, deletion, basically protecting privacy. For the exam, what I would suggest is this. GDPR is the most important of the international laws. You're absolutely going to see a question. I'll be very surprised if you get 100 questions deep and you don't see GDPR at least a couple of times. But these are the international laws you want to focus on at minimum. For the U.S., I would focus on the federal laws. I do see mention of the CCPA out of California. I think it's a fair bit less likely you're going to see anything on that one. And then there is the Privacy Impact Assessment, which is designed to identify the privacy data being collected, processed, and stored by a system, and to basically assess the effects of a data breach. So there are several privacy laws that explicitly require PIAs to be executed. So GDPR and HIPAA, our healthcare privacy, are two that actually mandate a privacy impact assessment. But this assessment typically begins when a system or process is being evaluated, so before it is implemented. So to conduct a PIA effectively, you have to identify the assessment scope, the data collection methods, and the plan for data retention. You'll also be expected to know the types of law. There's criminal law, which is just what it sounds like. That's going to cover acts like murder, assault, robbery, arson. Civil law focuses on what I'd call the business paperwork, contract disputes, real estate transactions, employment, estate, and probate, which would deal with assets when one passes away. And then administrative law, which applies to government agencies who have some leeway in enacting regulations that would apply in that category of law. So the CISSP exam really focuses on security-related generalities. You need to know more or less who these laws apply to in terms of which organizations, which types of organizations, and more or less what their aim is. You don't need to know the nitty-gritty details for the most part. You should be familiar with intellectual property protection. So when I share these, I always try to call out not just these four, but what they cover. So trademarks covers words, slogans, and logos. Patents cover intellectual property rights of inventors. Trade secrets are different than all the others in that a trade secret is intellectual property that you must maintain in secrecy. If you unintentionally disclose your trade secret, it is no longer a trade secret. And A copyright is automatically granted to the creator of a work, such as an author of a book, for example, upon creation. It can be registered, though, but it prevents others from reusing it. So Herman Melville writes Moby Dick. There's a copyright automatically granted. The protection only lasts 70 years beyond the creator's death, but it's automatic in nature. So we've got the lifespan and the renewal details out there. So number 20, you're expected to know the difference and the purpose of policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines. So a policy, if we think about a company policy like an acceptable use policy, for example, it's a general management statement. So a standard would give us specific technical controls. Think of, the ISO 27000 series. There are going to be some specific technical controls that are mentioned. Procedures go a bit deeper. They tell us how, right? The procedures are the step-by-step instructions. So here you see we've covered the why, the what, and the how. And then you have guidelines, which are really just optional recommendations and best practices to help you do everything beneath a little bit better, a little bit more effectively. Be familiar with what's mandatory, what's optional, what is their focus. The 4 steps in business continuity planning come up, and there's no one global difference between one global definition of business continuity planning steps. This is what you're going to see for the CISSP exam. Do make a note here that the business impact analysis, the BIA, happens within the business continuity plan. It's part of the process, as is the disaster recovery plan. Disaster recovery is a very technical, it's focused on technology, where business continuity is naturally focused on the bigger picture of the business. External dependencies come up on the 2024 exam more than we would have seen them on the 2021 exam. And that's really because of what has changed in the world. We've seen supply chain compromises. For example, the Solarigate with SolarWinds. We know that when a vendor in our supply chain is impacted, we can have problems. We also know in a disaster scenario, if we have entities that we rely on for specific types of resources. Let's take business continuity, for example. If I'm relying on a specific company for fuel for my backup generator, and they're affected by the same tornado that impacted my company, now I'm in trouble. So basically, we need to be sure that for critical resources, we're never depending on a single vendor that could be impacted by the same event that could affect us. So let's talk about risk. Risk is a very important topic. It is a fairly complex topic in that you may be challenged to calculate and make risk-based decisions in a quantitative way by doing math specifically. So in terms of risk, you have the risk categories. This is a group of potential causes of risk, so easy enough. Damage, disclosure, losses. There are risk factors. So risk factors basically increase risk or the likelihood of something happening. So physical damage, malfunctions, attacks, there are things that can happen that will increase our risk or susceptibility to a failure. So let's talk about response to risk. Some text will call this risk treatment. So think of it as another way to describe risk response. So here are your 4 main responses to risk. Acceptance means we do nothing. We just accept the risk and the potential loss. Pretty common when the risk or the dollar amounts are low. All right, folks, let me know if anybody else is having audio problems. I just want to pause for a moment here. Give me a thumbs up if we're good on the audio. Okay, yeah, my connectivity still says we're good, so I just wanted to be sure. So risk acceptance on its face means we do nothing. We just accept the risk. There's risk mitigation, where we implement a countermeasure, we implement a security control, and then we accept the residual risk, the risk that remains after our countermeasure. Presumably with that control, we have reduced the risk. We have risk assignment. So risk assignment is also called risk transfer or transference. That's where we assign the risk to a third party. The easiest example I can give you there is purchasing a cybersecurity insurance policy. We're assigning that risk over to that insurance company. So if the tornado hits our building, we've paid our insurance premium, they cover it for us. Oops, and one more here, risk avoidance. So when the cost of mitigating or accepting a risk are higher than the benefits of the service, an organization may just avoid the risk. And that could mean losing out on a business opportunity. If the potential loss is greater than the potential revenue, they may just avoid going into that new area of business. They may just forego that opportunity. So one in particular you want to just remember as being unacceptable is risk rejection. So to ignore a risk is unacceptable. We need to consider that risk and make a decision. But rejecting the risk, pretending like it doesn't exist, is a no-no. All right, number 26, quantitative risk formulas. This is a big one, my friends, and this is an area of complexity where you're going to have to put in the work to understand 4 key formulas and how to use them in the real world. So the exam is going to give you a scenario, and that scenario will include events or potential events, and they'll give you some numbers, and you will have to extract the information you need from that scenario to calculate the answers for quantitative risk formulas. So there's exposure factor for calculating the percentage of loss that an organization would experience if a specific asset were violated by a risk. There's single loss expectancy, which represents the cost associated with a single risk against a specified asset. So if I expected that I'd have 30% damage to my building in the case of a tornado, 30% is going to be my exposure factor. If the value of my building is $100,000, if I know the exposure factor and the asset value, I can calculate the single loss expectancy. It's asset value times exposure factor. 100,000 times 30% exposure factor, $30,000. That's my single loss expectancy. And there's the annualized rate of occurrence. So this is the expected frequency with which a threat or risk will occur within a single year. You want to be careful with this because we may have certain risks that occur less than once a year. And in that case, if I have say my chance of a tornado is one in every 5 years, my annualized rate of occurrence is less than once per year. So I'm going to have a fractional ARO. And we can use that information to calculate the yearly cost of all instances of a specific realized threat against an asset. So if I know that I have a $100,000 building and my exposure factor is 30%, and I know that my annual rate of occurrence is 1 in every 5 years, which would give me a 0.2 ARO. You want to watch for the ARO where the risks occur less than once per year, because you're going to have that fractional value. But in that case, I could calculate my annualized loss expectancy because I know that it's a $100,000 valuation. It's a $30,000 single loss expectancy. I know it's only happening once every 5 years. I can do the math and come to that final answer. So my annualized loss expectancy, if my single loss we said was $30,000 on a 30% exposure factor out of a $100,000 asset, 30,000 times an annualized rate of occurrence, let's say 1 every 5 years, that's 0.2. I'm simply going to divide 30,000 by that. I'm going to take 30,000 times that 0.2, and that's going to give me my answer. So 30,000 times 0.2 exposure factor is $6,000 a year. That's my annualized loss expectancy. So if that sounded complicated and like a lot of math right off the top of my head, it was. But do not despair. Out there on YouTube, I have a video called Quantitative Risk Analysis, just the formulas. I do cover them in the full course as well, but I have several topics that I've called out. I've basically cordoned off in specific videos so you can drill down specifically. The mindset was one of them. The QRA formulas was another one because it's a big area on the exam, very likely to appear, and not something that you can simply memorize. You really have to know how to use these formulas in a real way. Threat modeling, very likely to appear on the exam as well. This is number 27 on our list. Threat modeling can be proactive or it can be reactive, but in either case, the goal is to eliminate or reduce threats. So there are three high-level approaches to threat modeling that are called out on the exam. They may be focused on assets. Other approaches may focus on the attackers, basically identifying potential attackers and the threats that they would go after based on their goals, or focused on software, basically considering potential threats against specific software. So I hope you're hearing some of the key points I'm making through here. I'm trying to give you some steering on important topics, some key information about those topics, where to put your attention, where not to put your attention, because we only have so much time in this life. You definitely have some deeply technical content on here, but this exam tends to be a mile wide and a foot deep. So, when I talked about legal, for example, legal and regulatory, you need to understand those at a higher level basis. There are some areas where we're going to have to go a little deeper. So quantitative risk analysis is one of those. Threat modeling is one that's going to be a bit more shallow. So we've got these three approaches to threat modeling. There are some common threat modeling methodologies that you need to be familiar with. There's STRIDE, which was developed by Microsoft many years ago and focuses on threats related to software. There's PASTA, which focuses on developing countermeasures based on the asset value. So if you want an easy way to remember PASTA, I mentioned that it focuses on asset value. That's the dollars, right? It focuses up. PASTA is all about the dough. I love this simple reminder. This came from one of my candidates just the other day, and I had to laugh when she said that. PASTA is all about the dough. It's about asset value. VAST, which is based on agile principles, visual, agile, simple, threat. GRED, which is based on the answer to these 5 questions. What's the damage potential, reproducibility, the exploitability of the threat? What's the affected user population? And is it discoverable by the attacker? TRIKE, which is an open source model that's focused on acceptable risk, and that's acceptable risk in the eyes of the stakeholder. So I believe those are all the threat models you'll need to focus on for the exam, and probably a couple of extras. Well, let's talk about security controls for a moment. Our response to risk when we mitigate a risk is to implement a security control, a measure for countering and minimizing loss or unavailability of our services, our apps, our systems due to the vulnerabilities that we discovered through the evaluation process. Now, you may hear the terms safeguard and countermeasure used seemingly interchangeably. They're really speaking to types of security controls. Technically, a safeguard is a proactive security control that reduces the likelihood of occurrence. A countermeasure is a reactive security control. Don't need to pay too much attention to that, but if you see those words, I just wanted you to understand the nuance so you will be able to evaluate the question more effectively. If the language tells you to be proactive in your approach versus reactive, that can help you pick the best security control for the situation. So let's talk about the categories of security controls. There are 3, to be exact. There are technical controls. These are the hardware and software mechanisms we can use to secure, to reduce our risk. So this would be software or hardware. Then we have administrative, which speaks to policies and procedures defined in our security policies and other regulations and requirements. Administrative are the paperwork. And then the third category is physical, and these are items that you can physically touch. A gate, a fence, a lock. I'm going to pause here just to catch a couple of questions. Do you know where the full course can be located? So if you just go put CISSP Exam Cram in YouTube, you'll find my playlist. It is organized in the order I'd suggest you probably watch those. I will include a link in the follow-up email. And I encourage you to, while we're talking about it, I encourage you to find a plurality of resources. I expect you're going to use a couple of books. I expect you're going to use multiple video sources. You're going to pick the testing providers, the practice tests that you think look best for the way you work. But no need to worry about relying on one resource. You're going to find a lot of folks out there that will tell you which direction they've gone, so you can basically lean on the resources others before you have used. you'll find that the original CISSP exam cram I've got out there that's still good today has about 1.2 or 1.25 million views. So definitely a lot of folks gotten a lot of mileage out of there. Use it with my compliments. Now, so we have those 3 control categories. We have 7 control types. And you can almost guess how these work based on their name. So a deterrent control is deployed to discourage violation of policies. A preventive control is intended to stop unwanted activity. So think about a deterrent control. If I put good lighting on an area where I don't want people to go, that is going to discourage them from going there. Preventive, deployed to stop activity. So if I put up a fence, for example, a detective control like a camera. Compensating controls are a special category. These are options to other existing controls. So when another control is absent or ineffective, a compensating control is kind of a backup control of sorts. We have corrective controls, which modify the environment to return systems to normal after unauthorized activity has occurred. And the recovery control, so you won't necessarily see recovery control mentioned in all of the exam providers out there. It's really an extension of corrective controls, but it has more advanced or complex abilities, like a disaster recovery plan would be a recovery control of sorts. And then there's a directive control that basically is intended to guide or control the actions of subjects to encourage compliance with security policies. For example, on the front of our building, we put a sign that says no trespassing or authorized personnel only. That is a directive control. Enter here, directive control. I want to talk a minute about control overlap because it's a fact of the matter. In the real world, you're going to find that one control can have more than one function. Security controls are designed to work together often, and their functions often overlap. For example, a security camera can be a deterrent control because when someone sees that camera, that may discourage them from performing an unauthorized activity, but it's also a detective control. So if the camera is not discouragement enough, it's then detecting, it's recording their activity, or at least presenting that to someone watching the camera. So the context matters, and the classification of a control can depend on how it's implemented and the specific risk it's addressing. So I tried to lay out some keywords here. So exams are going to focus on specific keywords or phrases to hint at the type of control. I've listed out a few keywords that I would use to identify the different types of controls. All right, let's talk about supply chain. You're going to see increased focus on supply chain security and evaluation of vendors in our supply chain, more so than we saw in 2021. Again, just because of the changes in the world since the exam was last updated. So today, most services are delivered through a chain of multiple entities. And we need a secure supply chain that includes vendors who are secure, reliable, trustworthy, reputable, minimizing our risk. And there are a number of ways we can evaluate vendors in our supply chain. And some of these are easier than others. So on-site assessment is probably one of the more invasive. We can go visit the organization, interview personnel, observe their operating habits. That's going to take a lot of effort. That may be expensive. The one at the bottom, third-party audit, that's going to be the most expensive, other than when we're dealing with a cloud service provider, and more on that in a minute. But what we do with even the least sensitive vendor relationships is we'll review their policies and processes. We'll have some document exchange. So every vendor is going to fill out some sort of survey so we get an idea of what policies and processes they have in place, and if they meet our requirements, if they meet our version of a reliable and secure vendor. All right, so new in the 2024 exam, we are on number 33. So if it's okay with everybody here, at about 90 minutes in, I'm going to pause at about 85 or 90 minutes. We're going to take a 5-minute bio break so you can grab a coffee and visit the washroom if you need to. So new in the 2024 exam, we see mention of the silicon root of trust. So this is a specialized chip or module embedded directly into the hardware of a device. So what makes this special is the unchangeable cryptographic identity. It's immutable fingerprint. Basically, a silicon root of trust contains a unique, unchangeable cryptographic identity that's established during manufacturing. So if the firmware on a system is compromised, the silicon root of trust will detect the change because the signature no longer matches and prevent the system from booting. So in this vein, we have the physically unclonable function. So a hardware component that generates a digital fingerprint or signatures based on a unique physical characteristic of an integrated circuit or a chip. So when that physically unclonable function is queried or given a challenge, it responds with a unique output based on that chip's variation. And we'll see this used in secure boot as well, secure key generation, anti-tampering efforts. But they're a unique hardware root of trust. So that being said, the silicon root of trust, the physically unclonable function, they're all variations of a hardware root of trust, a line of defense against executing unauthorized firmware. And when certificates are used in full disk encryption, for example, they're going to use a hardware root of trust for key storage. Incidentally, when we implement full disk encryption like BitLocker on Windows or dmcrypt on Linux, it's going to use a trusted platform module or TPM, which is an implementation of a hardware root of trust. We'll touch on a TPM a bit later in our session. But you want to be familiar with the differences of all of these. Also new on the 2024 exam is number 35 here, SBOM, Software Bill of Materials. So this came about with some of those supply chain third-party risks like Solarigate, where Solarigate had some problems with their source code being infected from an external entity, from a bad actor. So what SBOM is a list of all software components, libraries, and modules that go into a particular software build or product. Think of it as an inventory of all the building blocks that make up that software product, including any particular DLLs, open source, or proprietary libraries that are used and the versions. It helps organizations better understand, manage, and secure their applications because when they have that inventory, that can be evaluated to find and address any known vulnerabilities. But there was an attack back in 2020 that led the U.S. government to require SBOM in the 2021 Executive Order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. There are multiple flavors of SBOM out there. You don't need to get into those details. You really need to understand that it's an inventory of the building blocks that make up a software product that will allow us to better understand our risk. But it really just functions as the inventory. That's the key. Don't worry about getting into the weeds on that. So let's move on to domain 2. So you can see domain 1 was quite large, but domain 1 is really foundational in a sense because we're going through a lot of material there in terms of policies, principles, legal and regulatory items. So really just establishing the foundation upon which the rest of the exam is going to build. So let's talk about asset security. This is a fairly small domain in the grand scheme of things and one that did not change in the 2024 exam. It's largely the same as it was before. So you want to be familiar with data security controls. So marking, labeling, handling, data classification. I would say data classification is the most important of these. I'll mention this several times today alone. Data handling, so shipping, chain of custody, understanding how data or systems travel in our environment. Data destruction, specifically secure data destruction, ensuring that when we delete data that it cannot be recovered through forensic means, that there is no data remnants. There are no remnants left on the storage that can be recovered. There's record retention. So if a record retention policy is 1 year, it should be destroyed when that data ages out. So remember this for the exam. When you keep data, when you retain data longer than it is needed, you increase the risk to your organization. Data that is deleted when its retention period expires is data that cannot be leaked or stolen in a data breach. tape backup security, so secure facility tapes labeled, ensuring that we understand the classification of the data, and that includes disk-to-disk backups or disk-to-cloud backups where we're storing in the cloud. Physical tapes are a little less common than they used to be. And data destruction methods, you'll want to be familiar with these. So in the video series and in the Last Mile book, I try to basically break out the different data destruction methods. And I think in the book, I even separate them into less secure and more secure. So erasing, for example, is not secure. Data is typically recoverable. Full destruction is going to be what we're aiming for, or what we might call crypto shredding in the electronic sense. Purging will happen in less secure environments, but at the end of the day, it's all about making sure we delete data in a manner that it is not recoverable through traditional or even forensic means. The destruction in the physical or virtual sense is going to be the most secure method. So for the exam, though, you want to be very familiar with record retention and the consequences of retaining data for longer than needed, and you want to be familiar with the methods of secure data destruction. But again, remember, if you keep data longer than necessary, it presents potential unnecessary legal issues. Because if you suffer a data breach and you've kept sensitive user data for too long, you've now violated their privacy, and it's going to require a privacy notification, a breach notification to those users. So in the world of data protection, confidentiality is often protected through encryption, both encryption at rest and in transport, and for that matter, in use. So we'll actually talk about encryption a bit further in domain 3, but encryption is how we're going to ensure our data remains confidential. Now, the classifications of sensitive data is different for various exams. These are the classifications you should know for the CISSP exam. And you see there are government classifications that go from unclassified to top secret, and non-government classifications that go from public to confidential. And you can certainly see the similarities between these. This is where the CISSP exam would focus. So asset classification is very important, and asset classification should match the data classification. So what do I mean by that? I mean that the systems, for example, if I have a computer that's used to access top secret data, the classification of that asset, that computer, is top secret as well. So the people who can read the data are the people who can use that computer, and I'm going to secure them in an equivalent fashion. So let's talk about defining sensitive data. So most simply stated, sensitive data is any information that isn't public or unclassified. It needs to be protected in some fashion. How it needs to be protected depends on the type of data. So two that you should know for the exam: personally identifiable information, or PII. Know these acronyms and know them well. So PII is information that can identify an individual: a social security number, a birth date or birthplace, biometric records, etc. Anything that identifies that person. And then there is protected health information, which can be related to a specific person. So if they're in the case of a hospital, for example, they would have the electronic medical record of their patients, and so that would be protected health information. That's covered by HIPAA that we talked about back in domain 1. So I want to talk about the cloud secure data lifecycle. There's not one specific data lifecycle that's thrown out there as the one you must remember. This one comes from the Cloud Security Alliance. It's very commonly used. So we'll start here. So we create data. So data can be created by users, like a user creating a file. We can have data created by systems. A system logs access. So to ensure it's handled properly, it's important that data is classified as soon as possible. Ideally, data is going to be encrypted at rest. And data should be protected by adequate security controls based on its classification. And that's an important distinction here. I cannot properly secure the data if I do not understand its classification. So before I get to the usage phase, I better have this pretty well secured, which means as soon as that data is created, I need to have a mechanism by which to classify it. Sharing that data refers to any time the data is in use or in transit over a network. We need to secure our data in transit just the same. Archival is sometimes needed to comply with laws or regulations. So we may need to retain data for 7 or 8 years in some cases. So the reason classification does not have its own bubble is I am following here the Cloud Security Alliance Cloud Secure Data Lifecycle. Now in the Last Mile book and possibly in the 2024 video, I also outline what I call a functional data lifecycle, which is one where I include classification because it is such an important step, and it's not about you remembering the steps, it's about you understanding the important activities at each phase of that data's lifecycle. So look for the functional data lifecycle out there. I hope it's in a video somewhere. I might have just attached it for the book. But we archive data based on our compliance for laws and regulations, or maybe even just company policy. And when the data hits the end of its retention requirement, it must be deleted to reduce our risk. And then destruction. And when that data is no longer needed, we destroy it in a way that is not readable or recoverable. That's where crypto shredding, for example, would happen. We make sure that we're deleting data in a fashion that it's not recoverable even through forensic techniques. There is no data remnants. There's nothing left on that device or storage of whatever type it is. So how we destroy data depends on how the data is being stored. So let's talk about data roles. You're going to be expected to be familiar with various data roles. The two that are most likely to show up on the exam are data owner and data custodian. So the data owner is usually a member of senior management. They can delegate some day-to-day duties. They can delegate, some responsibility. The data custodian, for example, may carry out a lot of the day-to-day work, just implementing the controls for the data owner. So implementation would be their work. But if the question on the exam mentions day-to-day, or it's talking about some operations level day-to-day task, data custodian is quite likely the answer. You want to remember, though, that management's making decisions, the owner's making decisions. The custodian is not deciding what controls are needed, but they are potentially implementing the controls that were mandated. Some other roles that pop up in GDPR, for example, we have data processor, which is a natural or legal person or other body that processes personal data on behalf of the data controller. And the controller is a person or entity that controls the data processing. Now, under GDPR, they also mandate a data protection officer to oversee some of this. But the DPO ensures the organization complies with data regulations. So responsibility can be delegated for certain activities. What cannot be delegated is accountability. So, for example, the senior executives of an organization are accountable under the law to maintaining the privacy of data, for example. And if they fail to do their due diligence and then implement due care, those company executives are potentially going to face legal consequences in court. But for the exam, be familiar with those GDPR terms, the data roles, the security controls. In particular, the notification of data breach with GDPR is 72 hours. I would park that one in your mind just in case. So someone said the storage media is destroyed, which is for sure a secure way to secure data from being recovered. Yes, in fact, if you have a physical hard drive, there are third parties. Most enterprises will use a third party that will come pick up the devices that need to be destroyed, and they will give you a certificate that confirms its secure destruction. So again, responsibility can be delegated, accountability cannot. So the executive can't delegate accountability down to some lower level person in the organization. Other methods to secure data and other considerations I wanted to call out here: geographic restrictions, so we can limit access to data based on a user's physical location. For example, access attempts originating from certain countries or IP addresses. I've seen organizations where we basically shut down all requests that come from outside their country because they have no customers outside their country, so they have no interest in wasting resources or being exposed to risk. So we'll just drop that traffic before it gets anywhere. But it's often used by organizations with regulations or security concerns specific to certain regions. We see this in regulated industries where they're dealing with sensitive information. Obfuscation involves intentionally making data less readable or understandable. So techniques like code obfuscation or data masking can be used to obscure the original data while still maintaining full functionality. In fact, three to be familiar with: we've got data masking, where only partial data is left in a field. No doubt you've seen, if you have a credit card, you've seen a form where you filled out your card and all you see are the last four digits. That's data masking. That's commonly implemented within the database tier, but it's also possible in the code of a front-end application. So it's not so much about where it's implemented, but what is implemented there. Now, if we were going to try to reduce our GDPR exposure, for example, there are a couple of other data obfuscation methods we could use. So, for example, anonymization is the process of removing all relevant data, so it's impossible to identify the original subject or person. If it's done right, anonymization means GDPR is no longer relevant for the anonymized data because the original subject cannot be identified. Now, granted, that's only good if you don't need the data. If you need to refer back to that data, that's going to be problematic. Now, in that case, we could look at pseudonymization, which is the process of using pseudonyms to represent other data. This can result in less stringent requirements than you would otherwise have under GDPR. You'd use that if you still need the data and you just want to reduce your exposure. All right, data states. We're on number 47. We're making good progress. And I'll just give you a surprise here. If we get further than 100, I've got an extra 20 parked at the tail end for you here, and we will go as far as we can go today. It's all important. So if we get to 100 before we hit 3 hours, I'm going to keep going. So buckle up and brace yourselves. All right, number 47, data states. You should be familiar with these three data states. In transit, which is data on the wire, commonly protected with transport layer security, think certificates, or tunneled through a VPN, which may be an IPsec VPN that's using certificates in a fashion as well. Data at rest, so data on storage, whether that's on disk, in a database, cloud storage, we're going to protect that through encryption of various types. You will get into some details of encryption in the cryptography section, and we'll likely talk about, in the full course, we'll talk about how we protect and encrypt in the database as well, for example. Now, in use refers to data in memory, so when it is being processed or used. So, for example, on a Windows system, if we look at the LSASS process, the Local Security Authority, you will find passwords stored in memory. And in Windows, we will use techniques to prevent access to the LSA process to dump its contents. We will also use a feature in Windows called Credential Guard to encrypt that password information, that credential data in that process. So at that point, we are protecting that data. We are securing it while it is in use. And ideally, data should be flushed from memory when the transaction is complete or the system is powered down. And in the case of applications that are using data, we're counting on the author of that application or designers of that application to implement good garbage collection to get rid of data in memory when it's no longer in use. Will we have access to the slides? Absolutely. So it'll be a few hours after the session is over, likely tomorrow morning. You'll have access to the recording. I'll put access to the PowerPoint in PDF format out there, and you can pick that up. But it'll probably be Saturday morning my time, fairly early. But these are your three data states. Remember them well. All right, let's get into number 48 here, protecting data at rest. So three methods of protecting data at rest. We have storage service encryption. So in the cloud, your cloud service providers, or CSP, will usually protect data at rest automatically at a service level. They'll encrypt it before they persist it to disks, to object file, or queue storage. And that's really just through lessons learned. If we go back quite a few years, AWS really just got no end of grief due to their S3 storage buckets that got compromised because their customers created them and didn't encrypt them. So CSPs usually encrypt by default. They'll give you additional options for encryption, all the way down to holding your own encryption keys, generally speaking. We have full disk encryption, BitLocker on Windows, DMCrypt on Linux. We're going to use a key pair there that will be stored on a hardware root of trust like a TPM, and that data will be encrypted. What's great about full disk encryption is your keys, your encryption keys, are stored on that hardware root of trust on the device. So if somebody, let's say a military unit, drops a computer in the middle of the desert and they have to leave in a hurry, if they've implemented full disk encryption, the bad guys can take that hard drive out of the system and run away with it. They can't access the data because the keys are still on the motherboard. They're still on the system somewhere. Now, in the world of relational databases, we have transparent data encryption. And we see that with relational databases, which will basically encrypt data in real time, the database, the backups, the transaction logs, and all at rest. And it doesn't require application changes. It generally does not impact performance in a noticeable way either. Some of your database platforms also provide row-level encryption or column-level encryption or data masking in one form or another. All right, so if we go just a step further on full disk encryption, you might see, I think if you're going to see disk encryption, full disk encryption is quite likely to come up as is TPM, the component on the motherboard. The chip on the motherboard used to store the encryption keys. So for example, in Windows, and in certain Linux implementations, you need a TPM of a certain version to be compatible with that operating system to support secure boot. You may also see mention of self-encrypting drives, which is a hardware solution. So FDE is software encryption, right? We're doing that in part through operating system supported software. Self-encrypting drives are a hardware solution. They're going to typically outperform software-based alternatives. They are based on the Opal storage specification. You don't need to go deeper than that on Opal. So these self-encrypting drives are typically solid-state drives. They're purchased already set to encrypt data at rest. They are immune to a cold boot attack. They're desirable because only the user and the vendor can decrypt the data. Protecting data in transit. Most commonly, we see HTTPS, basically using transport layer security, where we have a certificate, asymmetric or public key encryption that's encrypting that data. We might encrypt that data by using a VPN to connect our computer to the home office or our branch office to the home office with a site-to-site VPN, at which point we're encrypting that data in transit across the public internet. DRM, digital rights management, may come up. Just remember this one relates to entertainment content. I'm a little less certain you're going to see this on the exam, but it's still called out, so I wanted to just throw it in there because it's a gimme if you remember this one. So data protection is going to be number 50. There are a couple of other important aspects of data protection I want to touch on. So there's data loss prevention, very common in the enterprise today, a way to protect sensitive information and prevent its inadvertent disclosure. So DLP solutions will identify, monitor, and oftentimes automatically protect sensitive information in documents. We implement it through policies that we configure. And it may encrypt a document as it's being written, after it's stored in a cloud repository, or maybe even encrypted as a user sends it in email. So I love DLP because I can encrypt sensitive documents when a user inadvertently overshares. So if they send a confidential document to an external email address, I'm going to slap a DLP policy on that on the fly and encrypt the document as it leaves the organization so it is unusable when it reaches its external destination. These solutions will typically monitor for an alert on potential breaches, policy violations, so basically intentional or accidental. And the protection with DLP, one of the defining characteristics is that the protection travels with the document, with the file or the data, preventing local override of DLP protections. In fact, your cloud solutions will generally, as part of that policy, you can configure how often the user's system must connect to the DLP service to verify they still have access before they're allowed to access. So for sensitive data, I can say if you don't check in to see if you still have access tomorrow, you're locked out until you come back online and check in. So the cloud access security broker, this is an industry that's grown a lot in recent years, matured very quickly. This is security policy enforcement that can be installed on premises. It's typically a cloud service, and it's really monitoring our data usage. The original use case for a CISSP, it's called, the Cloud Access Security Broker is a CISSP. The original use case was exposing shadow IT, where users, not wanting to wait for IT to grant them certain resources, might just go spin up a cloud storage solution like Box or Dropbox without talking to IT. So a CISSP, one use case for a CISSP is we can prevent sensitive data from being stored in a third-party cloud repository, any repository we haven't sanctioned, for example. All right, my friends, that brings us to domain 3. Domain 3, in the grand scheme of things, domain 3 is a very large domain. There's a lot going on here. So we'll talk about some of the more important topics here in security architecture and engineering. We are about 6:15, so here in about 10 minutes or so, I'll find a spot where we can stop and take a quick break, and then we'll come back and make our way to 100. So let's talk through some secure design principles, definitely topics you want to be familiar with for the exam. These three come right from NIST 800-160, I believe. So we have secure defaults, where the default configuration reflects a restrictive or conservative enforcement of our security policy. So secure by default, we would call that. So some systems can be configured to fail securely. So that indicates that should any components in that system fail, it's going to deny access rather than grant access. Now, there are other systems that will fail open. So when there are systems where human life is at stake and the failure of the system, failing in a closed state, failing security would result in the loss of human life, it may be configured to fail in an open fashion. And then what I'd call a legacy security design principle is trust but verify. So trust but verify depended on an initial authentication process to gain access to the internal environment, basically the environment inside the firewall to the internal secured environment. But then it relied on just generic access control, role-based access control, etc. Trust but verify, due to the changes in the threat landscape now, trust but verify is not really considered sufficient, because if we have a compromised identity, that compromised identity is going to allow that attacker to run rampant in our trusted environment if we don't have additional controls in place. And that's where zero trust has supplanted trust but verify. Some other principles you should be familiar with: least privilege, ensuring only the minimum number of processes are allowed to run in supervisory mode. Only the minimum permissions are granted. We'll actually look at least privilege in the broader context here in a bit. Separation of privilege, basically increasing the granularity of secure operations. We separate duties. We potentially require two people to carry out a sensitive operation. But accountability in this process ensures that an audit trail exists to trace operations back to their source. You're going to hear me mention audit trail and accountability more than a couple of times. We're going to get into the audit trail and accountability here in just a bit. So one that comes up on the exam syllabus is keep it simple and small. So in the 2021 version of the exam, I recall it was keep it simple, but keep it simple and small is just a renaming of the concept. And at its core, keep it simple and small means complexity is the worst enemy of security. So what we want to do is to create the simplest and most cost-effective solution that meets our needs. So what we'll often see is we go with a best-in-suite solution over best-in-breed. So we'll build our cybersecurity based on a suite from one provider, where the functionality is all built in. The integration is automatic because it reduces our work. It allows us to rely on a single layer of intelligence, of AI and machine learning, and then we can augment that solution as we build. And it also enables organizations to move forward in an incremental fashion rather than demanding perfection. So I work with multiple clients. There's one client I've been working with for many years, and we've been creating quarterly initiatives to maintain and improve our security every 3 months for 7 or 8 years now, and we're not done. It just allows us to get a little better every cycle. But it's the original KISS principle when we were kids. It was keep it simple, silly, or stupid, but keep it simple and small is how that's been adopted here. All right, privacy by design comes up. So there's a set of principles that comes from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, basically making privacy an integral part of every system. So we're thinking about privacy all the way back in the design phase. So we're building privacy into the solution. And at the end of the day, we think about privacy as a positive sum approach. Adding privacy does not diminish functionality or benefit. And we think about privacy for the full life cycle of the process or system. Another 2024 addition is the Secure Access Service Edge. This is a design philosophy pretty closely related to zero trust network architecture. It brings a number of network and security functions together and delivers them as an integrated cloud service. So it's a number of components that come together. So the Secure Access Service Edge is called, it's SASE is the acronym. It's pronounced SASE. So SASE was first envisioned back in 2019. So according to Gartner, this is about a 5-year-old concept. It basically merges traditional WAN management into a unified whole solution using multiple cloud native architectures. So it's still considered an evolving cybersecurity concept. It's advancing rapidly, but I would say it's still evolving at a pretty significant pace. All right, so here is a big one, and that is the security model. So there are some items here that you're going to need to remember, and these don't have a real concrete use for most of us. So I'm going to pause here before we get into this to answer the question here. The canons and the preamble. So remembering the preamble and the canons of ISC are definitely important. They're fairly easy. They're fairly boring. And they're mostly common sense. I call them out in the book. I call them out in the video. I don't think you're going to find them difficult. What I will say about the canons is you want to remember them in order. So you're going to remember them from top to bottom, and you would need to apply them in that order. But you're talking about with the preamble, you're talking about 5-ish items you need to remember there. So security models, there's a lot to remember here. So this is number 56. So buckle up because this is a big one. So security models are used to determine how security will be implemented, what subjects can access the system, and what objects, what resources they will have access to. They're typically implemented by enforcing integrity, confidentiality, or maybe both in some cases, or maybe other controls. But each of these models we talk about lay out broad guidelines. They're not specific in nature. It's up to the developer to decide how these models will be used and integrated into specific designs. So there are definitely some policy and standard inputs that go into these models, and the developers can leverage these models depending on their goals. So if I were to say it more simply, a security model provides a way for designers to map abstract statements into a concrete security policy. It determines how security will be implemented, what the subjects can access in the system, and what objects they will have access to. So as a quick reference, I pulled this out of the Last Mile book that I wrote. Here's a quick reference table where I call out the different models, and you'll notice their focus here, be it integrity or confidentiality. And you'll notice there I mentioned model types. So some of these are model types upon which the models above them are based. So we have, if we're looking at model types, state machine model, the information flow model. So you'll notice there that Biba and Bell LaPadula are both information flow models. The non-interference model, another type. And a lattice-based model, another model type. So this one, with lattice-based, it's based on an interaction between objects and subjects, for example. So we're going to pause right here. We're about 20 after. We're running a bit ahead of schedule, which is good. So let's break for about 5 minutes. So let's come back at 27 after the hour, and we're going to pick up here in security models with these 3 properties that you need to know for exam day. So I'll pause back here. I'll see you in about 6 minutes. You need 7 minutes. I can give you 7 minutes. If you have any questions, we'll wait for our friend to come back and we'll cover that. So I had somebody ask to see that. You can see it right here. You can also pick it up in the PDF and see it in the replay. So this won't be the only time you'll see that. I'll leave that up on the screen and I'll see you back here in 6 or 7 minutes. All right, my friends, we are back. So as you drill down and learn those various security models, you're going to see 3 properties mentioned repeatedly. There is the simple security property, which describes rules for read. There's the star security property, which describes rules for write. And there's what's called the invocation property. These are rules around invocations, calls, like as calls to subjects. So make sure you know the difference between these so you know what you're reading when you're looking at those various models. So you'll see Bell LaPadula, which enforces confidentiality. And I've tried to lay out visually, so when you watch the full course, you'll be able to go back and listen to these repeatedly. So Bell LaPadula, no read up, no write down. So a user can't read higher classifications, and they also cannot write data down to a lower classification. They can't down classify data. So that's going to protect confidentiality. Bell LaPadula happens to be the only model that is used and was really created for the military. There's the Biba model, which is no write down, no read up. It's an integrity model, so the opposite of Bell LaPadula. Clark Wilson, which uses labels and what they call the access control triplet. And I'm just calling out some keywords here so you can identify these models. The take grant model is confidentiality based and it supports 4 basic operations: take, grant, create, and revoke. There's the Brewer and Nash model, which is also called the Chinese wall model. It was developed to prevent conflict of interest problems. So an example of a conflict of interest problem would be in a law firm, for example, who wants to represent both the plaintiff and the defendant in a legal case. They would have to create what's called a Chinese wall, or a firewall, they'll call it sometimes, to keep those 2 parties, the counsel for the defense and counsel for the prosecution, from communicating. Graham-Deming, which uses a formal set of protection rules for which each object has an owner and controller. There's actually 8 primary rules or actions under Graham-Deming. And again, we're covering 100+ topics in 3 hours. I am intentionally being very brief with these and trying to call out the key details. So how is today's session different than previous sessions by Pete? This is the first time I've ever tried to cover 100 important topics in a single session for you. So I'm trying to go end to end with key topics throughout, and really the more important topics that are high probability topics, and giving you some guidance on what's important about these, where to focus, where not to focus. We're on number 57, and that is the common criteria. So this is a means, a framework to enable an objective evaluation to validate that a particular product or system satisfies a defined set of security requirements. So the common criteria actually replaced two other evaluation criteria standards, the Trusted Computer System Evaluation Criteria and the IT Security Evaluation Criteria. And it did so quite a few years ago. So for the exam, I would recommend that, because the common criteria has superseded these both quite some time ago, before the 2021 exam, I would put my focus on common criteria. There are 7 levels here that you'll see in terms of evaluation standards for the common criteria that describes the level of scrutiny these systems undergo. All right. So back in domain 1, we talked about trusted platform module. It shows up again in domain 3. So I wanted to pull it forward and just mention it here again because it factors in cryptography. So the trusted platform module is a chip that resides on the motherboard of a device, like a desktop or laptop computer. It's multi-purpose. It's for storing and managing keys for full disk encryption and for secure boot. It gives the operating system access to keys, but it prevents drive removal and data access. So if the drive is removed, nobody can see it. Going to pause here. Is anyone besides Fahim having trouble seeing my screen? Are we all seeing the video fine here? Just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen share. Okay, good. All right. So you want to be familiar with Trusted Platform Module. Of the hardware roots of trust, I would say TPM is probably the one most likely to come up. So another acronym, we can get lost in a sea of acronyms. Another acronym that might come up is HSM, a hardware security module. So this is a physical computing device that safeguards and manages digital keys. So when we decide to encrypt storage in the cloud, for example, Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform will give us an option to manage our own keys, what they'd call customer managed keys. We might use a hardware security module to store our encryption keys for our storage. So a hardware security module, in some senses, is like a TPM in that it's protecting those keys, but HSMs are often removable or external standalone devices. All right, there's some deployment models that come up in the device world. You'll probably instantly recognize these when you think about mobile devices. There's BYOD, bring your own device, which is cost effective for the company and more convenient for the user because I can access company data on my personal mobile device, for example. So we see BYOD programs for our phones in many organizations. There'll need to be an acceptable use policy that outlines what the employee can do with the device during the working day, what data they are allowed to access. There'll be an onboarding problem because even if we're not managing the device because it's a personal device, your mobile device management platforms like Intune, like AirWatch will have a mobile application management feature that allows us to manage these BYOD devices to kind of put a sandbox around our company data, so to speak. And we'll need an offboarding policy, which will include a selective wipe of company data. This is going to be cost effective for the company, convenient for the user. What I'd say about the deployment models, you need to know them, but understand the advantages and the disadvantages of each. So a BYOD model is cheap and convenient, but it gives us less control over the device. We can certainly check to enforce a minimum operating system or ensuring that it's not rooted or jailbroken before we let them access company data, but we can't control anything about physical configuration directly. But we always want to make sure we have an acceptable use policy that tells the employee clearly what they can do with that device. And when we wipe a device, in this case, it's going to be what's called a selective wipe, where it's only taking out company data. But there are MDM solutions all over the place that will implement BYOD. Then you have corporate owned, which is just fully owned and managed by the company, enabling full IT control over everything. We have choose your own device. Now, this is where the employee chooses from a list of approved devices that the company has supplied to them. The employee can purchase devices on the list and bring them to work. The employee gets to choose the device, but there are fewer types for them to choose from. So it gives IT a smaller variety of devices to manage. It gives them control over manageability of that mobile device management effort. And then there's the corporate-owned personally enabled device, or COPE, which is where the company purchases the device, tablet, phone, laptop, whatever, and allows the employee to use it for business and personal. This is often a better solution for the company than BYOD from a management perspective, because IT can limit what applications run on the device. With your phone, I can't really tell you in a BYOD scenario what you're going to run. I can just tell you what you can do with my company data. So I'm kind of highlighting some of the advantages here. So bear these in mind when you're thinking about the different MDM policies and who owns the device in each case. BYOD, the employee owns. CYOD, the employee owns. Corporate owned and COPE, the company owns. Let's talk about hypervisors. Number 61 here. You're going to be expected to be level 100 familiar with hypervisors. So a type 1 hypervisor is what we call a bare metal hypervisor. It's where the hypervisor runs right on the hardware. So you've got VMware ESXi, KVM, Microsoft Hyper-V. Then you have a type 2 hypervisor, which includes a host operating system. The hypervisor runs on Windows or Linux. So that'll be VMware Workstation, Oracle VirtualBox. So a bare metal hypervisor is going to have reduced attack surface compared to type 2 hypervisor because it doesn't have that additional operating system. Makes it more secure if it's implemented properly. But you're going to see type 1 used for QA, load testing, and production scenarios. This is doing the real work for the business. It's typically going to be more expensive than a type 2 hypervisor, and it's going to run on bigger hardware. And then a type 2 hypervisor that hosted is going to be less secure than type 1 on the whole, even if implemented properly. It's going to be typically less expensive, and it's typically going to be used in development scenarios. It's a convenient way for a developer to have a virtual machine or an engineer to have a virtual machine to work through. So let's talk about some cloud technology here. You will be expected to be familiar with cloud deployment models, both in what they are and what their advantages are. So the public cloud, for example, is where everything runs on your cloud provider's hardware. So we're on number 62, which is cloud deployment models if you're just joining us. So we have the public cloud where everything runs on the provider's hardware. We can scale on demand. We have a lot of agility here because we don't have to buy hardware. We can pay as we go, pay for what we use. We don't have hardware maintenance. We're not operating a data center. Our skills requirement is much lower. I don't need virtualization and hardware and storage specialists. I can get into doing business more easily if I'm willing to cover that price for what I use. We have private cloud, which is a cloud environment in your own data center. You're 100% responsible at that point. It does have its advantages, though, because we can support legacy scenarios, for example, that may not be supported in the public cloud. Maybe we have an application we're just not prepared to upgrade to meet the minimum software standards that are supported on a particular public cloud platform. But it gives us the ability to support legacy. It gives us total control over the environment. It may make compliance easier in some cases. Then we have hybrid cloud, which is very popular, probably still the most popular today, that combines public and private clouds, allowing the company, the customer, to run their applications in the right location. So it gives us flexibility in legacy compliance and scalability scenarios where it makes sense to keep something on-prem in our private data center, we can do that. And if we have a new application we're developing for the cloud, we could run it out there right away. And you'll want to be familiar with the shared responsibility model, which speaks to cloud service models. So we just talked about cloud deployment models, which really talks about where we're deploying our cloud. Now we have cloud service models, which speaks to the type of services we're deploying. So in the shared responsibility model, we have on-premises. The 100% yours. Responsibility is easy. That's your private cloud. You own it down to the wire, the data center, etc. Physical security, all of those problems are your problems. Then we move into infrastructure as a service. This is your virtual machines. And you see here that the cloud service provider, AWS, Amazon, GCP, they take on some of the responsibility for you here. They're handling the virtualization, the servers, the storage, the networking, the hardware, the data center, all of the data center support systems. Platform as a service, you see the CSP is taking on even more responsibility. Now we're just focused on applications and data. And in the SaaS scenario, the CSP is taking on just about everything. There's a bit of sharing that goes on here because in the SaaS scenario, typically the customer still has some responsibility for data, security, and access control. I'm simplifying it here, but it's also simplified in your study material. So in that IaaS scenario, the CSP provides the building blocks, the network, the storage, the compute, the hardware, the data center. That's where you'll see services like Azure Virtual Machines, Amazon EC2, GCP Compute Engine. When we move into platform as a service, the CSP is taking on more responsibility. The customer is really just focused on deployment and management of their apps. These are going to be services like, I just grabbed 3 from Azure here. Azure SQL Databases, which is database as a service, API management, where we can deploy and manage our APIs in the cloud, and then Azure App Service, where we would typically be deploying web-based applications. In a SaaS scenario, the customer really just configures features. The CSP is responsible for management, operations, service availability. The customer is going to have some responsibility for their data security and potentially backing that data up. And then access control, because the customer configures who accesses the service. So 3 good examples: Office 365, ServiceNow, and Salesforce, all SaaS applications. So I want to shift gears and talk about containerization, something that's come a long way in recent years. We're on number 65. So containerization, this is lightweight, granular virtualization of a sort. So containerization reduces the overhead of server virtualization because it allows us to package apps in a container that all run on a shared operating system. So basically, containers do not have their own operating system, but when you containerize an application, it's essentially tricking that app into believing it has its own operating system. But we still have isolation concerns. So with a server, with a physical server, or even a VM, we're thinking about isolating at the network level, for example. But when we think about isolation in a container context, we have to isolate at the host, process, network, and storage levels. It's a 100% virtual operation because we may have multiple applications running here on the same virtual machine. In the real world, you're going to see Docker and Kubernetes. Really, Kubernetes has become the de facto standard for running your container applications, and all your major cloud service providers offer some sort of Kubernetes as a service. I talk about that in the full course and go through a bit more detail there. But I want to just give you a visual on how containerization compares to virtualization. So let's talk about the type 1 hypervisor, which is where we're going to run those production workloads, and look at how this compares. So you see here in the type 1 hypervisor scenario, I'm going to have virtual machines running on that iron, on that server, and each virtual machine has its own operating system. Now go over to the container side, and the container host is typically a cloud virtual machine. And you see in a single virtual machine there, I can run multiple applications. So where with virtual machines, I have the operating system overhead for each app I'm running, With the containerized app, I only have that operating system overhead spread out across all of those applications. So it allows me greater density and it allows me to scale more easily and to get more compute, more work out of my capacity there. So each VM has its own OS kernel, and in the containerization scenario, they share an OS kernel. So that should be, couple that with what you see out there in the full course with Kubernetes and the cloud scenario, and you should be well prepared. But with your containerized solutions, you're going to have orchestration, network storage, a container host to worry about. You're going to have container images. Think of container images as the containerized equivalent of virtual machine images. And the container registry is the repository where we store our container images. And you're going to have to secure all of these elements. But the isolation is 100% logical. So Kubernetes, managed Kubernetes is how we see this playing out in the real world. This is the de facto standard. You've got the container host, which is where the containers run. These are cloud-based virtual machines. And all of your CSPs will have some managed solution today. It's a platform as a service offering, effectively. So AKS on Azure, EKS and AWS, and GKE is what they call it over on Google Cloud Platform. All right, here's an example of a security standard that has been updated since the 2021 exam. So FIPS 140-2, the Federal Information Processing Standard. So systems are now being evaluated not against FIPS 140-2, which was established to aid in protecting digitally stored, unclassified yet sensitive information. It was developed by NIST, but it's for use by non-military government agencies. Now, in April of 2022, FIPS 140-3 superseded 140-2. Their FIPS security levels, I am dubious as to whether or not you will see any questions on these specific levels. I've laid them out here just in case, frankly. But if you're focusing on FIPS at all, it got direct mention in the syllabus in a way we didn't see prior. So focus on FIPS 140-3, even if you happen to see 140-2 elsewhere. Same but newer version of a standard. So let's talk about key management for a moment, the encryption key lifecycle. So just like we need to secure our data, encryption keys should be generated within a trusted, secure cryptographic module. They should be maintained securely throughout the lifecycle. So we need to generate the keys from a secure, trusted system, something that's, FIPS 140-3 validated, with tamper resistance and key integrity. Encryption keys should be distributed securely to prevent theft or compromise. So the best practice is to encrypt keys with a separate encryption key while distributing to other parties, meaning we're not going to send that encryption key. We're not going to share it through an unsecure, unencrypted channel. Not just going to send it across the internet. Encryption keys need to be protected at rest, never stored in plain text. This includes keys in volatile and persistent memory. Clients will use keys for resource access as access controls allow. Your acceptable use policy should set guardrails for data usage. There should be a process for revoking access at separation for policy breach or a device or key compromise. So for example, in PKI, in public key infrastructure, certificate services, you would revoke the certificate on the issuing certificate authority if that certificate were deemed compromised or the system upon which that certificate resides were deemed compromised. We would revoke. And then key destruction is the removal of an encryption key from its operational location. And key deletion goes further and removes any info that could be used to reconstruct that key. So MDM systems, Intune and AirWatch, for example, can remove certificates from a device during a device wipe or its retirement. Easy example. So other key management terms and concepts you'll want to be familiar with. The level of protection. So your encryption keys need to be secured at the same level of control or higher as the data they protect, similar to when we were talking about an asset being classified and secured at the same level as the data it's used to access. So the sensitivity of the data dictates the level of protection in this case as well. Key recovery, so circumstances where you need to recover a key for a particular user without that user's cooperation, such as in a termination scenario or unintentional key loss, you need a way to recover that certificate. One scenario that comes to mind is with full disk encryption. We have BitLocker key recovery keys. We can get them, we can store them in Active Directory, or we can store them in the cloud. And then there's the concept of key escrow. So this is where copies of keys are held by a trusted third party. And they trusted third party stores them in a secure environment, which can aid in many other areas of key management, including but not limited to a disaster at the company data center or a company ceases to exist for whatever reason. Maybe that escrow comes into play in a customer being able, to have continued access to their data. So let's talk about the goals of cryptography, number 67. Pardon me. So there are 4 goals of cryptography that you want to be familiar with. There's confidentiality, which we talked about back in Module 1, integrity, authentication. So we know confidentiality is about protecting the secrecy of data. We know integrity is about making sure that unauthorized changes are not made or unintentional changes are not made. So it may be accidental or intentional and malicious. Authentication is a goal. So verifying the identity of the entities involved in communicating or accessing our resources to make sure that all access is authorized. And then there's non-repudiation. So we've got secrecy, we've got data integrity, and then non-repudiation speaks to undeniable proof. So proving that the sender of a message, for example, actually authored it. It prevents the sender from subsequently denying that they sent the original message. So non-repudiation is making the evidence undeniable. So the other party, can't say, I didn't sign that contract, for example, because we have their verified signature that was authenticated. Let's move into cryptography. Cryptography is a massive topic. I'm going to touch on some important points here. I have a dedicated session out there for you that focuses entirely on cryptography. It's one of a handful I put together because this is such an important area, and it's one of those areas where most people don't spend a lot of time. So know the difference between a code and a cipher. So cryptographic systems of symbols that operate on words or phrases are sometimes secret but don't always provide confidentiality, a code. A cipher, on the other hand, is always meant to hide the true meaning of a message. A cipher is always secret. You're going to learn in the video series, or if you get into the book, you're going to learn about a number of ciphers. This is not going to be entirely practical. It's conceptual, but it'll be at least somewhat informative. Need to be familiar with a stream cipher and a block cipher and the difference between the two. The stream cipher is a symmetric key cipher where the plain text digits are combined with a pseudo-random cipher digit stream. So each plain text digit in a stream cipher is encrypted one at a time. It's not batched. So in a block cipher, we're applying encryption to a block of data. For example, 64 contiguous bits at once as a group rather than one at a time. So block ciphers are generally considered to be more secure than stream ciphers. You want to be familiar with the difference between symmetric and asymmetric cryptography, the strengths of these, when they are used, and how they are used together. So these are numbers 69 and 70. So symmetric cryptography relies on the use of a shared secret key. So if we were to call out the weakness of symmetric cryptography, it lacks support for scalability, for easy key distribution and non-repudiation. If I have 70 people, for example, in a conversation, I have to share that, I have to transmit that shared key to all of them. Symmetric cryptography doesn't give me a way to securely share that key by default. Asymmetric cryptography, on the other hand, relies on public-private key pairs for communication between parties. It supports scalability, basically secure key distribution, and non-repudiation. So symmetric encryption is fast for bulk data encryption. Asymmetric is going to be stronger and better in scenarios where we need to, for example, make up for the weaknesses or what lacks in symmetric. So let's talk about symmetric first. So you have AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard. This is the industry gold standard for symmetric encryption. Highly efficient, widely implemented. AES 256, I believe, is still the standard for top secret data in the federal government. Comes in various key lengths, gives us options in terms of security. You'll see triple DES mentioned. This is a variation of DES basically applying DES 3 times. Triple DES has largely been phased out and replaced by AES. AES is everywhere. So twofish and blowfish, I see them mentioned. I don't see them used a lot. Blowfish was used in a password vault that I used a few years ago. But twofish was a finalist in the competition to select AES. It's known for its strong security and its flexibility, and blowfish was the predecessor to twofish. Both of these, incidentally, were written by somebody you may have heard of, Bruce Schneier, author of Schneier on Security and some excellent cybersecurity books. In fact, one of the best-selling cybersecurity books of all time. Symmetric algorithms, remember, are used for bulk data encryption. AES is the standard. On the exam, if you get a question about a symmetric encryption algorithm, it's going to be on AES, almost guaranteed. So, in an exam of 100 to 150 questions where you are tested on potentially thousands of, hundreds of topics, you may only see one question on cryptography or a couple of questions, but you're going to have to remember a lot more data to field them all. I remember when I went into the exam, I was advised to remember which algorithms were in use, particularly to remember which are considered secure, and to remember the block size, the key sizes and the block sizes of those. So on this list, I would focus on AES above all others because it is the most commonly used. So you'll see here in this reference table, I've got the block size, the key size, the relative strength, and whether or not it's in widespread use today. So you see AES is the star of the show there. All right. So key length. So how does key length relate to security? So the relationship between key length and the work factor, the amount of effort required to break encryption, is exponential. So a small increase in key length leads to a significant increase in the amount of work required to break the encryption. So RSA, for example, is the primary asymmetric algorithm used on the internet today. It supports key sizes of 1024, 2048, and 4096. NIST recommends a minimum size of 2048 today. No doubt, as quantum, comes to the fore, 2048 may rise to 4096, but that's where it lies today. All right, common asymmetric encryption algorithms. So the big three are RSA, elliptic curve, and El-Gamal. You'll see Diffie-Hellman in here as well for a specific reason. So RSA is the oldest and most widely used. Elliptic curve cryptography is important because it offers similar security to RSA but with smaller key sizes. This makes it suitable for resource-constrained environments. So if you have a question on the exam about implementing security on a resource-constrained device, look for ECC amongst the answers. It's going to be a strong candidate for the answer. Diffie-Hellman is primarily a key exchange protocol allowing two parties to establish a shared secret key over an insecure channel. So this is where asymmetric cryptography works together with symmetric cryptography to make up for the weaknesses on that side. Asymmetric can help the symmetric help us transport that shared key to the other parties. So let's just look at a scenario here. So we talked about a public key and a private key. So the public key is the one that's shared. So for example, we got Franco and Maria here. So Franco wants to send an encrypted message to Maria. So he's going to request her public key. It's the key she can share with everyone. Maria sends her public key, or the application Maria is using sends her key over to Franco. Franco is going to encrypt the message using Maria's public key. Maria is going to use her private key to decrypt the message. So when we lay out these asymmetric key types, the public keys are shared amongst the communicating parties. The private keys are kept secret. So encrypting data, we're going to use the recipient's public key. So we used Maria's public key to encrypt the data, and then Maria used her own private key to decrypt. On a digital signature, you'll use your own private key, and to validate the signature, the recipient will use your public key. So someone asked which algorithm withstands quantum computing. So in the full exam cram, the 8-hour video, I have a section on post-quantum cryptography, which talks about which types of cryptography are basically vulnerable to quantum computing, and which types of algorithms, which at the time in 2021 didn't even exist. So NIST has actually selected their finalist for the quantum resistant algorithms. And what I told you back in 2021 was that the algorithms NIST would select would almost certainly be lattice-based algorithms, and in fact they are. You want to go watch that because I talk about a couple of different algorithms related to post-quantum cryptography. So I don't expect you're going to see a lot of questions, if any, on post-quantum cryptography, but I cover what you're going to need to know for the exam there. So make sure you know how public and private keys are used in these three scenarios here. That's the key. Those are the keys you need to understand at the most essential levels. Each party has both a private key and a public key. These are how they are used. All right, let's talk about hash functions. So these are related in some scenarios. They're part of the picture in cryptography. So a good hash function has 5 elements that are must have. So they must allow for an input of any length. So I can give that hash function a chunk of data of any size, and for each chunk of data, regardless of the amount of data I put in, it must produce a fixed length output. It needs to make it relatively easy to compute the hash function for any input. It needs to provide one-way functionality, and what that means, so encryption is two-way functionality, right? If I encrypt something, if I have the right key, I can decrypt it, right? With a hash, when that hash is produced, if it's done right with a secure hash function, it cannot be reversed. It is one way. And the hash function must be collision-free, meaning that two different inputs can never result in the same hash as the output. That's why MD5 is limited in its use largely to simple operations like file hashes. It's not used in major cryptographic operations because MD5 has been exposed as being problematic in terms of collisions. So common uses of algorithms. So how are different algorithms used? So symmetric, I mentioned we have AES 256, AES and AES 256 is kind of the gold standard for government top secret data. Symmetric is used for bulk encryption. AES is going to be your most popular algorithm there. Asymmetric, that's where we can securely distribute symmetric bulk encryption keys because asymmetric has a public and a private key pair. We can use asymmetric in identity authentication via digital signatures and certificates, and we can use it for non-repudiation services and key agreement. Hash functions actually play a role in verifying digital signatures, in generating pseudo-random numbers, and in a number of integrity services around data integrity and authenticity. So what do I mean by data integrity? For example, I've got a script I wrote on a Linux system a long time ago. It will calculate the hash of a file before I copy it to the cloud. After the copy is complete, it will calculate the hash of the file in the cloud to confirm that the hash on-prem matches the hash in the cloud and that integrity has been maintained. Hash functions are great for that. You should be familiar with cryptographic salts and how they help us in securing our data against attack. So attackers may use something called rainbow tables. These are tables of pre-computed password hashes, for example, that they use to identify commonly used passwords. A salt, a cryptographic salt more specifically, is a piece of random data that is used as an additional input to the one-way function that hashes the data, a password or a passphrase. So by adding a salt to the password before it's hashed, it reduces the effectiveness of the rainbow table because the hash is different. So identity platforms like Entra in Microsoft Azure, they implement salting there, so the salt is injected before the password is hashed. So a rainbow table is going to be utterly ineffective because the hashes won't match anymore. 73, digital signatures. You want to be familiar with digital signatures. The standard out there works in conjunction with 3 encryption algorithms, the DSA, RSA, and then the elliptic curve DSA, where DSA stands for digital signature algorithm. So in the full course and in the book, I do give you some visualizations to lay out step by step how symmetric, asymmetric, hashing, and digital signatures work. So you'll have an explanation and a visual to go with it. And you want to be familiar with those and how the private and public keys work and the core functionality of a hash, variable length inputs and consistent length output. Let's talk about public key infrastructure, PKI, for just a minute. So foundational concept you're really going to expect it to be familiar with for the exam. So certificate authorities, CAs for short, generate digital certificates that contain the public keys of the users and a private key as the other half. The users can distribute the public key to people with whom they want to communicate. The certificate recipients verify a certificate using the CA's public key. So certs are used for web, network, email, device, and application security, a variety of functions, really. So if we look at the types of certificates, a few of these are called out in the official study guide. So the user is used to represent the user's digital identity. So you can have a user certificate. The root certificate is a trust anchor. This is the certificate of your root CA, essentially, your root authority. You've got domain validated certificates that prove ownership of a domain name. Now, in high security scenarios, we'll see extended validation. It provides a higher level of trust. We see these used in the financial services sector real commonly. But that root is the root of trust. That basically establishes the root all the way to the top. So you want to be familiar with a wildcard certificate. This can be used for a domain or a subdomain. It allows us to use a single certificate for multiple host names. So for example, if I have a wildcard certificate that's just *contoso.com, it's basically going to work for web.contoso.com, mail.contoso.com, basically multiple names within my domain. So I can create many FQDNs with a single certificate. A code signing certificate is important. So code signing provides proof of content integrity. So code signing certificates digitally sign the codes, the code or an application file that mitigates the danger of impersonations. So even in our administration of our internal environment, it's quite normal that we will sign our scripts and our utilities with a code signing certificate. If I make a custom script, I'm going to sign it with a code signing certificate so my colleagues can verify its integrity. They can feel good that it's untampered with. There are self-signed certificates. We see self-signed certificates used all the time in development scenarios. It's basically issued by the same entity that's using it. A developer can create a self-signed certificate with a little free, open source utility. It doesn't have a certificate revocation list. It can't be validated or trusted. It's just cheap for dev purposes. Machine certs for computer identification. Email will be for digital signature purposes. And typically, so remember, self-signed is for development scenario, so never for a production scenario. That's the main thing you want to remember about self-signed. Computer, self-apparent. Email, we're usually talking about digital signatures to verify identity. Third party. A certificate issued by a widely trusted third party like GoDaddy or DigiCert or any number of, well-known third party, widely trusted certificate authorities. We're going to use those for our public-facing company website, for example, because I can let my customers communicate in HTTPS and they can validate that certificate with the trusted authority I bought it from because it came from GoDaddy or DigiCert, where those customers out in the world, none of them are going to trust my internal root certificate authority because it's not intended for external use or widely trusted in the same way or meticulously maintained in quite the same way. You might see subject alternative name. So the SAN certificate, we call it for short, what this allows us to do is support multiple domains or even IP addresses on a single certificate. It enables support for multiple FQDNs from multiple domains, and we can even specify IP addresses all in one certificate. If you go buy a SAN certificate from a third party, you're going to pay in the hundreds of dollars, and it's going to get more expensive as you add more names. It's very specialized. Certificates are going to be valid for a limited period of time. The current industry guidance, I think, is somewhere around 398 days. It may have even dialed back to less than that. I haven't looked in a few months, but the recommended lifespan of a cert's pretty short now. 75. This is new on the 2024 exam, quantum key distribution. So this is a method that involves quantum mechanics. It enables two parties to generate a shared random secret key known only to them. The key can then be used to encrypt and decrypt messages securely. So because they're using quantum techniques, an eavesdropper intercepting the key will introduce detectable anomalies that basically make it easy to detect eavesdropping, theft by any third party trying to gain knowledge of the key. So that's an advantage over traditional cryptography, but it's not the same as quantum cryptography. We're not talking about anything related to data security. This is strictly related to keys. Now, there is a drawback of quantum key distribution, and that's that it usually relies on having an authenticated classical channel of communication. That means the third parties have already exchanged either a symmetric key of sufficient length or public keys of sufficient security level. And in practice, one can achieve authenticated and sufficiently secure communication without QKD at a less expensive price point. So where is this actually used? As far as I've seen in my research, commercial solutions currently target high security scenarios that use key distribution by courier, where other key distribution schemes are considered inadequate. So it's a niche use case at this point. QKD is used only to produce and distribute a key, not to transmit any message data. So I'm going to pause right here. So somebody asked, can we do some practice questions today? The fact of the matter is, in getting through 100 of these, we're not going to have a lot of time to really go deep in questions because it will take us a couple of hours. So what do you say when I send the follow-up email? I'm going to check my schedule this weekend and we'll do a dedicated practice question session sometime in, let's call it late January. I've got some company coming in January, but I could do something last week of January, first week of February. So I'll try to get you some practice time with me where we can go through that. Now, I also have some practice questions that I've shared in previous live sessions. What I will do in my follow-up message is try to go grab a couple of links to those previous live sessions because I've got the archives out there, and I will walk you through what I call my READ strategy. It's kind of a productized evaluation strategy for complex questions, but I'll get something in front of you today that you can watch at your leisure, and then we'll try to schedule a dedicated session where we can drill down. All right, so I mentioned for some of the more challenging and large topics, I have dedicated sessions. You'll see a cryptography drill down out there on the web, and you'll want to grab that one as well. Now, one thing I'm not covering today is the long list of attacks. You do need to be familiar with common attacks, network attacks, wireless attacks, cryptographic and cryptanalytic attacks. I have a dedicated session on attacks and countermeasures as well. So one of the defining characteristics of the CISSP exam is you need to be able to um, describe, different technologies and so forth, but you also need to know how to use them to solve problems. So you want to maybe have a look at that cryptography, drill down if you don't have a lot of experience in that area. But I'll share with you the link to the playlist that has, the two primary videos as well as the CISSP mindset, the quantitative risk analysis formulas, cryptography drill down, attacks and countermeasures, so you can really get into a focused session where you need to. So we see some topics come up on the exam syllabus around site selection and facility design. So really understanding how to envision and design our facility in a secure way. So for site selection, we're going to pick an area where we have good visibility, good accessibility. We've made sure that the effects of natural disasters will not affect us to a greater degree than we are comfortable with. And understanding from a facility design perspective the level of security needed by our organization and planning for that before construction begins. Because if we need to have secure work areas of a specific variety where perhaps we need, let's say badged access, security guards, a man trap, access control vestibule, we can design all that before we start our build. So secure work areas, you want to know how to design secure work areas. The fact of the matter is that there should not be equal access to all locations within a facility. We have high value assets sitting in restricted access areas, and our valuable and confidential assets need to be located maybe closer to the heart or center of the protection provided by a facility. They're not in the office at the edge of the building. You have to get in the building, sign in, go through the badged entrances, sit down and authenticate and be authorized to access. So, we're going to basically push those sensitive assets back into more secure areas, and our centralized server or computer rooms don't need to be human compatible. They're not meant for human convenience. They're meant for safe and secure system operation and data security. So the functional order of security controls. So back in the 2021 exam, this is number 76. I want you to remember the functional order of security controls is fairly important. So you notice here they go in a pretty natural cadence. There's deter. We try to discourage bad behavior, right? So lighted areas, signage can deter, direct. If we put the lighted sign up there, the do not enter, and somebody comes in anyway, we want to have maybe a locked door to try to deny them entry. If they try to break that lock, I want to then detect their efforts. And if they're trying to break in, I want to have sufficient security in place to delay their efforts. So a lock that's not easily picked. So those first four elements are really factors related to my physical controls. We're talking about physical security here. The last two, determine and decide, are human decisions, right? So here I'm determining what the situation is, what the risk is, what the consequences are, and deciding how to deal with it. So physical controls can be divided into those three groups, those categories. We talked about security controls, so the physical can be divided into administrative, logical, and physical. I've got some examples of each. So administrative, I can have awareness training, emergency response procedures. For the logical, I can have intrusion detection, I can have alarms, closed circuit television, fire detection and suppression. In terms of the physical, fencing, lighting, locks, access control vestibules, dogs, guards. And remember this for the exam. There is no security without physical security. So if you see a question on the exam where physical security has been ignored, if a malicious person can gain physical access to my facility or equipment, they can do just about anything. If they can get into the wiring closet in the office, for example, there's nothing to stop them from just yanking wires out of the switches. They can wreak havoc. So physical security is that fundamental layer. So in the physical security world, bollards may come up in a question on the exam. These are short, sturdy vertical posts. They can be fixed in place, or in some municipalities, you'll see bollards that are retractable. Like a car or a vehicle can't pass a particular area unless they scan a badge or something, at which point the bollard is lowered into the ground and they can drive over it. But it's basically to prevent vehicles from forcibly entering a restricted area. And then you've got what we'd call the access control vestibule, sometimes called a man trap. This is basically a system that ensures only one person can enter into through a passage at a time. So basically, the person enters through the open external door. That door is closed, and their identity is verified. They're generally through a badge, and then they are allowed in. So this is going to protect against tailgating and piggybacking very effectively. Previously, it was called a man trap. I think it's going to be called access controlled vestibule on the exam, but just in case, you'll be equipped with both. But it's basically some variation of two interlocking doors where the outside door opens and then closes before they are then verified and the inner door is opened. It's just one person passing through. In terms of fences, height matters. There's really psychology to height. So 3 to 4 feet in a fence is only going to deter a casual trespasser. An 8-foot fence with barbed wire is going to deter determined intruders, and context matters. For example, if I build a fence right next to a tall tree that they can climb up and then jump over my fence, that's not really smart. So there's certainly some context even then. So the fence is a deterrent control. It's preventing and it's deterring and preventing. So PETUS, the perimeter intrusion detection and assessment, is a detective control. That's expensive and it's not foolproof. It can generate false positives. I don't know that you're going to see PETUS on the exam, but I wanted to call it out just in case. In the full course in the book, I do go a bit more into the physical design. So you'll also want to be familiar with video surveillance. So this is reliable proof of a person's identity and activity if we get a system of sufficient quality. So this is going to be detective in nature, and it's going to help us with the audit trail of a sort, because we'll be able to basically reconstruct the sequence of activities. Security guards, basically a preventive physical security control. They can prevent unauthorized personnel from entering a secure area. Access badges to electronically unlock a door, preventing unauthorized personnel. So video is going to be detective, security guards are preventive, access badges preventive. So can you see how each of these may also serve to deter potential attacks? If somebody sees a security guard, they're going to be discouraged from trying to get into a facility, right? So depending on the scenario and the way the control is implemented, you want to go back to what I talked about earlier in the language around the security controls and interpreting the scenario to get to the right classification. All right, lighting. When you're planning lighting, you want to think about location, efficiency, protection. So installing lights at the entrances and exits. Combination of automation, dimmers, and motion sensors will save on cost without sacrificing security. Maybe lights that kick on at dusk or when somebody walks in front of them. Also making sure that the attackers can't remove or break the lights. So putting the lights high enough they can't be reached, or protect them with a metal cage so they can't be broken with a rock. Deterrent, really. Lock types, you want to be familiar with lock types. There are a few of those called out in the official study guide. I call those out as well in the full video course, but you want to be familiar with the types of locks and their relative security. Evidence. So you're going to see a fair number of questions around evidence, and evidence storage is going to come up. So number 78, I'm calling out evidence storage here. So you want to retain logs, drive images, virtual machine snapshots, data sets for recovery, internal investigations, or maybe even legal actions. So when we're protecting our evidence, we're going to store evidence in locked cabinets or safes. We're going to have dedicated or isolated storage facilities. If it's digital, we may want to store it in an offline or isolated fashion. Access restrictions. So where the evidence is stored, it's going to be heavily protected. We're going to have a log there where we track who goes in and out and why they have touched that evidence for any reason, what their purpose was. For digital assets like data, we may create a hash. For a laptop, for example, we'll create a forensic image, and that will include a hash at the system level and the file level, so we have proof of integrity throughout. So audit trails and access logs are all going to be very useful for physical access control. So we may need to create these manually by security guards, or we might generate them automatically with the right equipment. Smart cards and proximity readers can, allow a user to badge in and it gets logged electronically into a file. So we have that record of where they've been. So the need for clean power supplied by electric companies is not always consistent and clean. So we might need a UPS basically to give us consistent clean power. It's also going to potentially give us power for minutes depending on its size in the event of a power failure. So really, the UPS can clean up the power coming in for us, but we've got two needs typically. We've got short term and long term. So the UPS is essentially a battery. It's a standby device. So when the primary power goes down, it's going to provide power for a limited period of time. It's going to allow us to shut down cleanly and protect, systems and the data from corruption. A generator, on the other hand, is a power source that's going to be powered by diesel, gas, propane, natural gas. When the power from the grid fails, it can be started, manually or automatically to give us power for an extended period. We'll be thinking in terms of days or even, weeks. It's going to give us sustained alternate power. So one gives us short-term power for graceful shutdown. The other is an extended period of time. So just remember those as short-term and long-term. There are a couple of areas of fire safety that you'll definitely be expected to be familiar with. So fire extinguisher classes, the A through K. So number 81 here is your fire safety. So you've got your fire extinguishers and then your fire detection methods. So the official resources call out 5 methods of detection. You've got them here. Not going to go through these one by one, but you'll see here that I've called out the method, the typical applications, and their strengths and weaknesses. Let's get into domain 4. So the OSI model, the 7-layer model, which has been around forever. You're going to expect it to be familiar with all 7 layers. You're expected to be familiar with what happens at each of these layers. So here are some protocols that exist at each of those layers. You'll also be expected to be familiar with the TCP/IP model. So number 83, I've thrown up TCP/IP here. And you'll notice here that I've kind of mapped them so you can see the equivalent of the TCP/IP model, which was built specific for the TCP/IP suite. But the exam may also test your knowledge of the units of our protocols at each level. So at the physical layer, we have bits. At the data link layer, we have frames. In the TCP/IP world, we have packets at the network layer. And at the transport layer, we have segments or datagrams, depending on whether we're using UDP or TCP. You're going to want to be familiar with all of this. So you'll need to know the difference between TCP and UDP, when we use these and what makes them fundamentally different. So you see TCP is for connection oriented, when integrity beats time sensitivity. So when I'm trying to transfer an important file and I want to be sure that it gets there in one piece, I'm going to use a TCP session. If I'm streaming audio or video in real time, I'm going to use UDP because retransmitted packets have no use to me in a real-time scenario. So UDP supports also multicasting and broadcasting, and it's really an unreliable method where the timeliness of the delivery is more important than the integrity. So there's no air detection, no flow control in UDP. So I've got those compared for you there side by side. Then we have carrier sense multi-access. There's collision avoidance and collision detection. So how to detect or avoid collision. So there's collision detection and collision avoidance. So you see CD is effective after a collision to detect it and help with retransmission. And then collision avoidance is a technology that's effective before the collision. So it's typically going to reduce who is transmitting and when and how. So one is detection, the other is avoidance. I'm going to go into that in greater depth in the full course, but I want to make sure that you're going to have this on your radar as something you need to remember. First time on the exam, we see IPv6 mentioned. So be basically familiar. You know what an IPv4 address looks like. If you're not familiar with IPv6, brush up on the basics. You know, it's a 128-bit address. There are basically enough IPv6 addresses for every grain of sand on the Earth. Be familiar with the private subnets in IPv4. So you've got the Class A 10 dot, the Class B 172.16, and the Class C 192.168. These address ranges cannot be transmitted across the public internet. Your private ranges are defined in RFC 1918. We also see called out in the syllabus the castings, so multicast, broadcast, unicast, and anycast. So I tried to describe what makes each of these unique and what their relative support is in both IPv4 and v6. So you've got them in one place. These show up pretty prominently, so I'd remember these, not a lot to worry about there. Wireless security is going to factor on the exam potentially, so you want to be familiar with wireless security. So WPA2 was an encryption scheme that implemented CCMP, when CCMP is based on AES. So CCMP was basically created to replace older, less secure mechanisms. So you may be familiar with WEP, which was one of the oldest wireless encryption protocols. It's not really used anymore. So CCMP uses AES with a 128-bit key, but WPA2 replaced WEP and WPA, and it uses CCMP here for the encryption. Now WPA3 was released in 2018, and it addresses the weaknesses of WPA2. It uses the stronger GCMP 256 for encryption. There's two versions. There's a personal and an enterprise version. So one intended for home use, the other for corporate use. So WPA3 uses simultaneous authentication of equals. It uses, it basically protects against brute force attacks. It uses a secure handshake called Dragonfly, and it also uses perfect forward secrecy. So it's immune to offline attacks because it's not reusing keys. So you want to be familiar with the improvement of WPA3 over WPA2. I've laid out the personal and the enterprise versions here, so you've got the difference here. And the government has specific requirements. So the enterprise supports 256-bit AES, which is required in the US government. You may see EAP, Extensible Authentication Protocol, and its variants mentioned. So EAP is an authentication framework. It allows for new authentication technologies to be compatible with existing wireless or point-to-point technologies. You've got PEEP, which is protected EAP, which encapsulates EAP methods within a single TLS tunnel. And LEAP was actually a Cisco proprietary alternative that was developed some time ago. It's been around a lot of years now. For the exam, I'd be familiar with EAP, PEEP, Radius, 802, 1.x. You want to know the security features and improvements of WPA versus WPA 2. 802.1x is covered pretty thoroughly in the video and book resources. You'll want to be familiar with VPN, and I'm going to call out the most important topics here. So 87 is virtual private network. We've got which basically extends a private network across a public network and then gives us an encrypted tunnel. So you've got the split tunnel versus full tunnel. The full tunnel means all VPN traffic is going to run through that tunnel, both for internet and corporate. The split tunnel, which we typically see in work from home scenarios, traffic destined for the corporate network will go through the VPN tunnel, and internet traffic where the user is just browsing is just going to go out their internet pipe on their wireless. And then you've got remote access versus site to site. So IPsec site to site VPN is going to can use an always on mode where both packet header and payloads are encrypted. So we'd call that IPsec tunnel mode. And then in a remote access scenario, a connection is going to be initiated from a user's PC or laptop for a shorter duration. We'd call that transport mode. You want to be familiar with these. In the book, which was my most recent production, I actually lay out the difference between some of the IPsec technologies in terms of how the packets are created, in particular, authentication header and encapsulating security payload. You'll want to know the difference here. So the authentication header provides a mechanism for authentication, but it does not encrypt the payload. So encapsulating security payload goes a step beyond this because AH is not performing encryption, so it's going to be faster. So ESP is going to give us data confidentiality encryption, and it's going to give us authentication, data integrity, data origin authentication, and replay protection. ESP can be used with confidentiality only, authentication only, or both. So you got multiple options there. So know the difference between AH and ESP. IPsec modes, again, the transport mode is going to be good for host to host traffic. Tunnel mode, we're going to have a paraheader, so tunnel mode is going to be good for gateway to gateway security. You may see something along the lines of converged protocols. So these are protocols that basically transmit over a TCP/IP network. So neither of these two were mentioned in the official study guide for 2021. These seem to be new mentions in the 2024 syllabus. You've got InfiniBand over Ethernet, which is basically transmitting remote direct memory access over an Ethernet network. It gives us lower latency and higher throughput than Ethernet alone. And then compute express link, so CPU to device and CPU to memory connections. You may see fiber channel over Ethernet, iSCSI, voice over IP. These are all still going to be relevant. They're all still converged protocols because they run over an existing network. And that's the main thing you want to know. So here's a picture I pulled from the book just to give you a visual. That's really what it's talking about, are these various functions running over the TCP/IP network. So in transport architecture, I think that's around 4.1.6, you'll see the management control and data planes mentioned. So the management plane handles configuration, monitoring, and security management. So you're going to see protocols here like SNMP and NetConf. The control plane is responsible for managing network routing protocols that facilitate communication between devices like your switches and routers. So the relevant protocols here are going to be routing protocols like OSPF and BGP. And then the data plane is responsible for forwarding the data packets between the devices and the networks. You'll sometimes hear the data plane referred to as the forwarding plane. In fact, when you get into specific examples like software-defined in SDN, software-defined networks, you're going to see the data plane also called the forwarding plane. So the data plane, though, is responsible for forwarding the packets. There are two switching types that are new, that are mentioned in the 2024 syllabus. They're new to the exam. There's cut-through switching, where the switch makes a forwarding decision as soon as it receives the first part of the frame. There's the store and forward method, where the switch waits to receive the entire frame before making a forwarding decision. I call out some examples of this in the book, and I think I tried to call out some examples in the 2024 addendum. You'll have to check my memory on that. If you don't see anything in the video and you don't have the book, ping me and I'll give you the answer if it's not clear in the video. Network performance metrics came up as well. So I called this out as number 90. Bandwidth, throughput, latency, jitter, and signal to noise ratio. These are fundamental characteristics. Just remember what these mean. I've tried to call them out to make them fairly simple. East-west and north-south traffic, also a new mention in the 2024 version of the exam. This is number 91 on the 100 list. So east-west traffic is where the traffic moves laterally between servers within a data center. The defining characteristic is that the traffic remains within the internal network. It's all traffic between trusted nodes and networks. Access controls and micro-segmentation and isolation policies can raise security. I can use VLANs and subnets to basically an access control list on firewalls and routers to reduce access between trusted nodes. But that's going to be your east-west traffic. North-south traffic, on the other hand, is where traffic's moving to nodes on the public cloud or internet. It's leaving the trusted network. It's going to bring security concerns like data compromised, inadequate authentication, distributed denial of service attacks because we're opening ourselves up to untrusted entities. And while I'm seeing you throw that link in here with the book, I intentionally published the book in a digital only form, so it's an ebook. It comes in like 3 different formats, so you can use it in the reader of your choice or in the web. But it's also a living book. So whenever somebody asks me a question, if I can make minor improvements to better explain a concept, I can come back and touch that book, press a button, and you instantly have access to the latest version, and you will get a notification when that happens. All right, segmentation, so network segmentation. There's a physical segmentation and logical. We might do this to boost performance, to reduce communication problems by segmenting systems that frequently communicate near one another, or to provide security, to prevent some segments of the network with communicating with our secure or sensitive systems unnecessarily. I might put my databases over into a segment of my network where only my application servers and my DBAs can reach them, and I don't let my clients all get to them. So in terms of just old school network segmentation, you've got intranet, which is a private network designed to host similar information that you might find on the internet. You've got the extranet, which is a section that can kind of it's sectioned off to act as an intranet for the private network, but it may also serve information to the public internet. You'll have a network segment that's sometimes called a perimeter network or a demilitarized zone, a DMZ for short, where we'll host public-facing services in a secure segmented network. So the extranet's a cross between internet and extranet. For DMZ, look for DMC or perimeter network, 2 ways to say the same thing. But this is how we can control traffic and isolate sensitive environments. Now, in terms of physical segmentation, we see two methods called out. There's out of band, where we physically separate the infrastructure into distinct zones, alternate communication paths for different traffic. There's air gapping, which is complete physical isolation. This is common in high security government networks and critical infrastructure. If you're ever listening to C-SPAN, you'll hear congressmen, questioning people on the floor of Congress, and somebody will say, "I can show that to you in a SCIF," meaning they're going to go into a secure room, air gapped, all of that, so they can look at top secret information in a very secure setting. Logical segmentation, basically segmenting the network without additional physical hardware. We see some specific techniques called out. In-band, separating network segments, configuring router switches and firewalls to control the flow using techniques like subnets and VLANs. You've probably heard of subnets and VLANs at this point in time. You may see virtual routing and forwarding mentioned, which facilitates coexistence of multiple routing table instances on a single router at the same time. This is fairly common today in IP routers. And a virtual domain are the network segments or chunks that are created through logical segmentation with techniques like virtual routing and forwarding. In the VRF context, these may also be called VRF domains. So virtual domain and VRF domain, 2 ways of saying the same thing. And then I just wanted to call out here VLANs you've heard of, logically segmenting a local area network into sub networks. VLANing is something we do at layer 2. I give you a visual in the video and the book on that. So VLANing happens at layer 2, where network switches typically operate. Remember, our VPN is the encrypted tunnel. I gave you the key items you want to remember on the exam when it comes to VPN, the most important in my opinion. So virtual routing and forwarding is where a single router or switch functions as multiple virtual devices. And virtual domains is where we are segmenting that single network device like a firewall or a router or switch into multiple independent devices. Microsegmentation, you hear about this a lot in the cloud. This is taking the concept of logical segmentation to a more granular level by further dividing apps and workloads into small segments or microsegments. So we might, in the cloud, for example, we'll put potentially relational databases over in a particular subnet that are all of the same classification, and we'll have security that only allows certain types of traffic to come in. So if my relational database listens on port 1433, maybe I only let 1433 traffic into that subnet from the sources that I expect, my application servers or my database administrators using their secure admin workstations. The policies and controls are going to be very targeted in this scenario to logically isolate to the degree we need to achieve the level of security we want. Also new in the 2024 exam, you may see virtual private cloud, the network that consists of cloud resources where the VMs for one company are isolated from the resources of another company. That's the key. And the separate VPCs can be isolated using public and private networks or segmentation. A VPC is going to have a different name in different places. So in AWS and Google Cloud Platform, they call it a VPC, real simple. In Azure, they call it a virtual network or a VNet, but it's all the same concept. Now, when we get into third-party connectivity, we may see some agreement types that come up, and these are called out, and you want to be familiar with these for the exam in terms of their purpose. So a service level agreement stipulates performance expectations like maximum downtimes, like we'll pay for 3 nines of availability or 4 nines of availability, and we'll generally have penalties in there if the vendor doesn't meet expectations. You're generally going to use SLAs, service level agreements, with vendors. If you set up a service level agreement with another department within an organization, that is typically called an OLA, an organization level agreement. 2 other agreement types that may come up: the Memorandum of Understanding, the MOU. This is a formal agreement between 2 parties indicating their intention to work together toward a common goal. It's kind of similar to an SLA in that it defines the responsibilities of each party. It's really just a more formal alternative to a handshake. It does not have the binding power of a contract. It lacks that extra protection. The Memorandum of Agreement, yeah, and that's the key right there. It's less formal than an SLA. There's no monetary penalties. It's just signaling our intentions and outlining what we intend to do. Now, if you want to take it to the legal contract level, that's where we go to a Memorandum of Agreement. This serves as a legal document and describes the terms and details a bit further. So remember that the MOA is a legal contract, the MOU is not. All right, I'm going to take you to domain 5. So here we're going to start with number 94, the AAA protocols, and the AAA protocols actually have an I in front of them, so identification is the first. This is implied. The subjects claim an identity, and the identification can be as simple as a username for a user, depending on the scenario. Authentication, the subjects prove their identity by providing credentials like the matching password for a username. Related concepts like non-repudiation, MFA, password biometrics may surface in these scenarios. It's not new to this exam. Continuing through the A's, the second A is authorization. So after authenticating subjects, systems authorize access to objects based on their proven identity. So least privilege and separation of privilege are going to factor here when we grant only the level of access necessary. Audit logs and audit trails record events, including the identity of the subject that performed an action, so we can prove what happened and who did it. So authorization happens after authentication, and accountability is really here to provide proof of what happened. What did the subject do? From what system did they do it? To what objects did they perform those actions? So identification plus authentication plus auditing equals accountability, roughly speaking. Multi-factor authentication may come up on the exam. So multi-factor can include something you know, something you have, something you are. So they call something you know type 1, something you have type 2, and something you are type 3 authentication factors. So when you're performing multi-factor authentication, where they might try to trick you on the exam, and trick is probably not the right word, but they may challenge you by giving you two MFA factors that fall into the same category that are both something you know, like, hey, if you use a PIN and a password, is that technically, secure multi-factor? You want to watch what they're giving you in terms of the factors. Authentication methods, I'm just going to lay them out real quick for you here. So we've got password, which is, on its own, not great. Passwordless is kind of that solution everybody wants to get to. But when we go to passwordless, it usually introduces cost, biometric concerns, or maybe even some device dependence. If we're doing face or fingerprint, we might have to have a specific device. So if I were to lay them out by quality, here's how I'd go from bad, good, better, best. NIST, by the way, and you want to remember this for the exam, NIST recommends against using SMS as a second factor because that has been compromised in the real world. Yes, somewhere you are is mentioned in the official study app. It's actually mentioned in my bigger course. I actually took that slide out of here in the interest of time, but thank you for mentioning that. I believe it's mentioned in the book, but I'll make doubly sure. I'm writing that down while we're talking here. All right, the Authenticator app. You want to be more or less familiar with what an Authenticator app. I assume you're familiar with either Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator or some other, identity platforms. Authenticator gives you a primary form of authentication for your cloud identities. It can also be used as an additional verification option for self-service password reset or multi-factor. Like, for example, the Microsoft Authenticator, a user has to download the phone app and register their account. You can get it for iOS and Android. I've got more Authenticator apps than I can count at this point. But it's going to give us an easy way for a secure second factor. You may see an oath token come up. So this is open authentication. It's a standard that specifies how a time-based one-time password code is generated. So your Authenticator apps can serve as a software oath token. So that six-digit code that changes every few seconds on your devices? That's going to happen in an Authenticator app. That's your software oath. Hardware oath, it's going to be a small device that looks like a key fob that changes refreshes every 30 or 60 seconds with a secret key. The software oath tokens are much more common these days. FIDO2 may come up. That uses asymmetric cryptography for authentication, and the user has a physical device. It's either going to be USB or NFC that they can use to authenticate. So be vaguely familiar with FIDO. I do cover that in the course. Federated authentication allows us to more easily authenticate users across multiple organizations. The most common federation scenario you'll see these days is where you use a social identity like your Google or Facebook or Apple or Microsoft account to authenticate to a third-party website like a Dropbox or a HubSpot. So in that case, the service provider, Dropbox or HubSpot, trusts the identity provider, the Google, the Facebook, the Apple, and that way the user can use an identity that they're comfortable with, and Dropbox and HubSpot, the third party, they can get out of the custom identity business and they can rely on a proven secure identity platform. This is also great in enterprise scenarios. We use federation to facilitate simplifying and unifying authentication across multiple organizations. I mentioned Windows Hello just to the comment I see here. I actually mentioned Windows Hello as a passwordless method in the larger course. I didn't want to get in the weeds here since we're limited on time. Single sign-on may come up on the exam, number 97. The user basically can log in once and access multiple applications. Single sign-on based authentication systems are often called modern authentication systems. So what's the difference between single sign-on and federation. Let me give you one important difference. Single sign-on is generally for one organization, so it's single sign-on within the organization. Federation is a multi-organization scenario. Password Vault shows up in the 2024 syllabus. So the Password Vault can store passwords locally on the device so the user doesn't need to remember them. It's typically going to use strong encryption. In the case of a vault, take a LastPass or a KeepPass. It's only going to be as secure as the owner's password for the vault. So that'll be important. So typically can use multi-factor. Now in the cloud, we store credentials, we store secrets in a different way with key management systems. So this shows up under 526. And your CSPs will offer a service where basically we can store any kind of application secret in a centralized secure storage. And in this context, a secret is really anything we want to control access to: API keys, passwords, certificates, tokens, crypto keys. As somebody mentioned here in the comments, the authenticator apps can be used sometimes to store passwords as well. Apple has a great new passkey functionality that's fantastic, but you're not going to get into that on this exam. But your KMS, your key management system, centralized secret storage, usually with API level access, so you can work it into your DevOps processes and your CI/CD. So your deployment automation can communicate and retrieve those secrets in a secure fashion when they are needed programmatically. I mentioned subjects and objects repeatedly. I wanted to call them out here because they're called out in access control. This is number 99. A user group or service accessing resources known as subjects. The resources they are accessing are known as objects. That can be files, folders, shares, printers accessed by the subjects. So these are going to come up often when you're talking about access control. You want to be familiar for the exam. So in the subject of access control, we have mandatory access control. That's where access is determined by the system, not the owner. Uses classification labels. In discretionary access control, the owner or creator of an object can control access at their discretion. The owner has full control. Non-discretionary access control enables enforcement of system-wide restrictions that override object-specific access control. That's a form of mandatory access control. And then there's rule-based access control, where we basically have a list of rules that's commonly found in your firewall access list. So you want to be familiar with all the above here. All right, number 100. So what I'm going to do for you, it's 757. What I have done is captured 120 basically important topics. So anybody that wants to stick with me, I'm going to go through all 120 of them. If you want to go to bed or get off to your weekend, fine, you'll get the recording. But after I finish number 100 here, I'm going to go through the rest of them all the way to 120. So zero trust. This is a modern approach to security architecture where no entity is trusted by default based on 3 principles: assume breach, verify explicitly, least privileged access. It has largely replaced trust but verify, but it's supported by defense in depth, which advises a layered approach to security. So you'll also see policy decision points and policy enforcement points mentioned on the exam in Domain 5 on the syllabus. And it may not occur to you where this comes from. I recognize this immediately as coming from NIST Special Publication 800-207, which is NIST's Zero Trust document. So basically, in our security strategy, the policy decision point is where the policy decisions are made, such as in Microsoft, what used to be Azure Active Directory, it's now called Microsoft Entra. In conditional access, we're going to create policies that will make decisions on access based on risk, the device, the location, the user, the resources they're accessing, the application, and the policy enforcement point basically enforces the decision of the policy decision point. I go down the rabbit hole pretty well in the 2024 addendum on zero trust, covering both the control plane and the data plane of zero trust. So you want to dig into that 2024 addendum. Biometrics may come up on the exam. So I'm going to pause right here. We're at 101. It's 7:59, so we hit 100 in 3 hours. And I have 120 here that will take us all the way through domain 8. So if you'd like to stick with me, stick with me. If you wanna bug off for the weekend, do that. I'll have the recording out to you in a few hours either way, but I'm going to keep going here to anyone who wants to stick with me. So biometrics may come up on the exam, and not just biometric authentication methods, but biometric errors in particular. So we know biometrics are a form of authentication using an individual's physical characteristics. So fingerprint scanners are common, retinal scanners, um, iris scanner. Both retina and iris scanners are physical devices typically. Voice recognition. We can use vein, basically using blood vessels in the palm as a biometric factor. Gait analysis, which is the way an individual walks. There are all sorts of options here. Basically, know these at a high level, and know that generally speaking, there are going to be some privacy concerns that we have to address in biometric authentication methods. But biometric is, common today. We just have to address the privacy concerns that come with them. Facial recognition looks at the shape of the face and the characteristics, the mouth, the jaw, the cheekbone. Microsoft has Windows Hello as passwordless authentication that someone actually, I think, mentioned earlier. That's using facial recognition. That was released in Windows 10, and it uses a special, camera, and it's better than other facial recognition programs that can have problems with light. It requires a camera of a certain quality for sure. All right, let's talk about biometric errors. So biometric authentication methods are going to identify users based on characteristics like their fingerprints or facial ID, right? Or eye, most commonly. The crossover error rate identifies the accuracy of a biometric method. It shows where the false rejection rate is equal to the false acceptance rate. So, and to move the crossover error rate higher or lower, we can increase or decrease the sensitivity of our device. So the crossover error rate is where the two, I'm going to give you a visual here as well, so stay here with me. A false acceptance occurs when an invalid subject is authenticated. We call this a type 2 error. You'll want to remember that for the exam. I put it there for that reason. So in this case, an invalid subject was authenticated and accepted when they should not have been. It's sometimes called a false positive. A false rejection occurs when a valid subject is rejected. This is a type 1 error, sometimes called a false negative. So false rejection is not good, it's undesirable, but false acceptance is generally considered worse because we're now allowing unauthorized access unintentionally. Here's where the crossover error rate is. If we were to chart the false rejection rate and the false acceptance rate, crossover error rate is where those two meet. All right, we're going to move into domain 6 for our next item, which is 102. So we're talking about assurance challenges with virtualization and cloud. So in the cloud, the cloud is made possible by virtualization, right? It's going to enable dynamic environments that we need for a global delivery. And depending on the cloud architecture, we might have to perform multiple layers of auditing. We have to audit the controls at our provider. We might need to audit what happens within the infrastructure we manage. Now, to be effective, the auditor has to understand the virtualization architecture of the cloud provider. So we're talking about Microsoft, Amazon, or Google in the CSP bucket here. And for the customer, we're talking about cloud consumers. So when I have a third party to come in and audit me, let's say I'm a bank, the auditor needs to know how to audit me, but they also need to know how to get assurances that the CSP meets their standards. And as you can probably already guess, an auditor just can't call up the CSP. They just can't call Amazon, Microsoft, or Google and say, hey, we're going to audit you, because they are so big they would be audited into the ground. So typically customers don't have the right to audit in the cloud. So if you're over in the ISC squared CCSP exam, you want to understand the type and frequency of testing that a CSP allows. I wanted to pull this over here to say something simpler to you. CSPs are typically going to have a penetration testing and vulnerability scanning rules of engagement statement that says you can basically scan your configurations. You can do some penetration testing to make sure your configuration is secure, but you have to do it in this context. Your major CSPs, however, if you need assurances about the environment that they manage, the hardware, the network, the facilities, the personnel, your major CSPs are going to make a SOC 2 Type 2 or similar report available on demand in lieu of an audit. So the SOC standard, this is the Statement on Standards for Attestation Engagement. So this is an audit standard intended to enhance the quality and usefulness of SOC reports. So these reports are designed for larger organizations like your cloud providers. And the cost of a Type 2 report can easily run 30 grand or more. So it's going to be it's a big deal to do one of these. You've got the SOC 2 Type 1 report, which assesses the design of the security processes at a specific point in time. You've got the Type 2 report that assesses how effective those controls are over time by observing operations, usually for a period of 6 months or better. The SOC 2 Type 2 report has become a global standard. The Type 2 report's more reliable. It's higher, it gives us higher confidence because it actually tests the controls. So if you remember nothing and in the full course and so forth, I'm going to mention the SOC 1 and SOC 3 reports. If you remember nothing else about SOC reports, remember SOC 2 Type 2. Know that you can get it from your cloud service providers. It does require an NDA typically. So, Amazon, Google, or Microsoft will let you download a SOC 2 Type 2. They'll typically prompt you with an NDA right before you download it. All right, let's talk about vulnerability management. And I'm going to talk vulnerability management. I want to talk pen testing, and then I want to talk about the difference between the two. So I know we're a little bit over time, so anybody here that's left with me, and there's quite a few of you left, stick with me. We'll probably be done by 1:30. And if you need to take off, you'll still catch the recording in the morning. You're just going to get all 120. My early Christmas present to you, let's call it. So we have vulnerability management, which includes routine vulnerability scans, periodic assessments. So that's our overarching program, right? That's the process. We have our vulnerability scanners. That's the tool we can use to detect known security vulnerabilities, weaknesses, and absence of patches or weak passwords. And we use a scanner as part of our vulnerability assessment. We scan the environment, we get the report, the scan output, and then we assess that to determine where there are vulnerabilities we must address. As a follow-up to this, there are a few different types of vulnerability scans that you should be familiar with. I call those out in the larger materials. For example, you can have a credentialed scan where you scan your network and you provide that scanner with credentials so it can log in with some level of privilege to systems so it can find things that it can't find anonymously. But know the difference between vulnerability management, the scanners, the assessments, how they're related here. And the vulnerability life cycle comes up in the big picture here. So you want to be familiar with the 5 phases of the vulnerability life cycle called out in the book and full training materials. So identification, analysis, responses, validation, and reporting. With your vulnerability scanners, you're typically going to see vulnerabilities reported as a CVE. So the CVE is a list of the CVEs are basically publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. It includes a CVE ID, a description, a date, and a comment. The CVSS is an overall score assigned to a vulnerability. Now the score is not reported in the CVE listing. You have to get that from the National Vulnerability Database. Now your vulnerability scanners, the tools are going to pull a lot of this together for you. But the CVE list feeds into that National Vulnerability Database. It's actually synchronized with the MITRE CVE list too. All right, let's talk about a penetration test by comparison. So a penetration test is an active test that attempts to exploit discovered vulnerabilities. So I could use a penetration test to attempt to exploit vulnerabilities that I discover with my vulnerability scanner. Maybe I use an open source scanner and that's part of my reconnaissance. I scan my target and identify the weak spots. And as the pen tester, I can then attempt to bypass or actively test the security on those to exploit vulnerabilities. And once I exploit a system, I'm going to try privileged escalation techniques and lateral movement. Now I might escalate my privilege vertically, basically jumping into a higher level of privilege, or horizontally, where maybe I somehow grab another user's rights. I move sideways. Pivoting is the process of using an exploited system to access other systems. I pivot and I start moving laterally throughout the environment. You want to be familiar with the penetration testing cycle as well, covered in depth in the full materials. So let's talk about the pen test types. These are definitely called out in the official study materials. So with a known environment test, we call this also a white box test, because we shine the light on this. We give the tester basically substantial or full information of target systems and networks. And I can tell you, when we use an unknown environment test where the tester is completely blind, the black box test, because there is no light shine, they have nothing. It doesn't take too many black box tests to come back clean, where I'm going to bring that pen tester back and start giving them information so we can plan for more invasive testing to find our weak spots so we have targets to improve. Partially known environment. So if I have some black box tests come back, completely clean, nothing major, I might go as a next step to a partially known environment and give them some information about my environment. Hey, here are my networks. Here's how people can get in the door from outside. Maybe, here's the VPN endpoint. Give the tester a little bit of a head start. With any pen test, before you allow a pen test to take place, the purpose of the test, the scope, who's performing the test, which systems are in scope, which are out of scope, that's all very important. It all needs to be captured and immortalized in a signed legal contract. So if you are pen testing in any form, you don't want to do it. Even if you're just a pen tester, working on a red team for your own company, if you're part of the organization you're testing, you still want to make sure that you have permission to do what you're doing. I've seen an employee basically trying to look like a hero take down an e-commerce system because they were trying to do some pen testing to find weak spots, and they wound up implementing their own denial of service attack. It was pretty terrible. Let's jump past this. So lateral movement, I'm going to give you some basic terms you want to be familiar with if pen testing is not your thing. So lateral movement is gaining access to other systems, basically moving to other devices after basically compromising an initial system. Privilege escalation, where we're executing code with higher privileges than the user that's running it. So generally this is with a higher level account, but in some cases it's a horizontal privilege escalation where the user gains access to another user's resource. And then there's persistence. This is where the tester achieves a persistent presence in the exploited system, basically long enough that they can stick around in this environment over a period of time and gain access to additional resources. Maybe establish command and control. Let's see here. So cleanup, basically the final stage of the test, you're going to clean up your work. Ethical disclosure comes up on the exam as well. So a bug bounty program, which is where an organization gives a monetary reward to ethical hackers. That definitely comes up. Pivoting, we talked about, basically compromising a system and then using that to attack other systems on the same network. I expect on the exam we see red team, blue team, and purple team mentioned. So the red team is offense. That's the internal testers trying to test the effectiveness of our program. They're basically emulating likely attacks. Blue team or defense, that's the internal security team attempting to defend. And purple team is actually process improvement. It's not a separate team at all. It's where the red team and the blue team come together. It is called the purple team because when you mix red and blue, they become purple together. So that's process improvement. I don't think white team will come up. I threw it in here just in case. The white team is the basically unbiased observer, the judge or referee that makes sure everybody's playing by the rules of engagement for the game that you're playing. So penetration testing versus vulnerability scanning, what is the difference? A vulnerability, because they do seem to share some similarities. So a vulnerability scan is a scan for weaknesses that results in a report that we can assess. A pen test is where we go more in depth and we basically simulate an attack on those weaknesses. Vulnerability scans are using mostly automated tools, where a pen test is going to use automated tools and manual techniques. Basically, almost anyone can do a vulnerability scan. I've got, a tier one analyst in at least a couple of environments where the tier one analyst is doing the scans and giving us the reports so the senior level folks can assess. A penetration test takes special skills. That's really the difference. Think of a vulnerability scan like a fire alarm that warns you of a fire, but it doesn't say exactly where or how bad the fire is. The pen test is like a firefighter testing the fire alarm and the sprinkler system to make sure that it's secure and functional. Vulnerability scans are generally not intrusive, certainly not if you do them right. A pen test can be intrusive, it may be disruptive, it can be destructive. You got to be careful. Let's talk about auditing. Auditing is going to factor significantly. So we're on number 105, and I want to talk to you about ultimately the three types of audits that are called out that you need to be very familiar with on exam day. So an audit is a methodical examination of an environment that we use to ensure compliance with regulations, to detect any abnormalities. It serves as a primary type of detective control. How often we audit depends on risk. We may have compliance requirements that drive it. The degree of risk can also affect how often we're auditing. But secure IT environments rely heavily on auditing, and a lot of your regulatory obligations require regular audits. In the healthcare space, in financial services, audits are a fact of life. The audit trail, I've talked about this repeatedly. We have records of activities happening on different systems. Ideally, we're going to bring these together in a central location, which we'll talk about in a moment. But the audit trail is how we reconstruct an event, extract information about an incident. We use it to prove or disprove culpability of a party in an incident. It's really a passive form of detective security control because we can come back and look at it after the fact. Audit trails are essential evidence when we're prosecuting cyber crimes. But it's how we get down to a reenactment, a reconstruction of a sequence of events. So I talked about accountability. So accountability is maintained for individual subjects by using auditing, which requires the audit logs, that audit trail, so users can be held accountable for their logged actions. So by establishing that audit trail, we're essentially promoting good behavior in compliance with the organization's security policy, because the subjects in our organization know that their activity is being audited. It is being logged and audited on a regular basis. Security audits and review. So these basically ensure that our programs remain effective over time. And audits can also be performed to oversee a number of processes. We can audit our internal processes to assess if our patch management, vulnerability management, change in configuration, if they're all in a good place. So audits aren't necessarily just for a particular public-facing system or for a regulatory requirement. Our audits can be entirely internal in some cases. And by auditing on a regular basis, we can catch violations of our security policies and secure principles to make sure that our programs remain effective. So auditing and due care. So really auditing is a due care activity. Security audits are key in displaying due care to those regulatory organizations. We are showing them through audit results that we are complying with the regulatory requirements that we fall under, say with HIPAA, or contractual requirements that we see through PCI DSS for cardholder processing. But due care means we act with common sense, prudent management, and responsible action. That's really the due care element there. It's responsible action. Audit reports often contain sensitive information. That means only people with sufficient privilege should have access to the full detail. So for example, security administrators will have full detail to the audit results. Senior management, who are often going to be less technical people, are going to get a high-level summary, perhaps less technical. Now, I want to give you a reference table here. Okay, so you've got internal audit, external audit, and third-party audit. So an internal audit is all in-house, right? We control it. An external audit is where we call a third-party organization like, one of the big four audit firms, and we have them come in and audit for us. We still control the audit. We ordered it, but it gives us an unbiased, independent, skilled assessment. Can also be used in many cases to help us demonstrate compliance with regulatory standards. And then there's a third-party audit. That's where an outside auditing firm comes in, but it's an external organization, perhaps a regulatory body, that is mandating that audit. And all they do is say, hey, you're going to be audited, like this happens in the banking industry, right? The external entity is going to mandate the audit, and about all you have control over is the scheduling of it. Know the difference between internal, external, and third party. And that's the simple version there. I pulled these tables from the book. So here's a slightly more detailed version that shows you who initiates, who controls, who performs, and who is typically consuming that audit report. I like Nathan's example for risk for due diligence and due care. Nice. All right, domain 7. We're going to jump into domain 7. This is number 106. So we're talking about digital forensics here. Pretty good section of this on the exam. So legal hold is where we're protecting any documents that can be used as evidence from being altered or destroyed. A legal hold is sometimes called a litigation hold, and what we're doing is holding that document in the document or documents, usually collecting them into what might be called a case. But we're bundling them and storing them in an immutable format, meaning they cannot be changed. And chain of custody comes into play in digital forensics in investigations because the chain of custody tracks the movement of evidence throughout its collection, safeguarding, and analysis. It documents each person who handled the evidence, the date and time it was collected or transferred, and the purpose for that transfer or handling. It confirms appropriate collection, storage, and handling. When you're investigating, you will collect evidence, you will store the original in a safe, secure, and immutable format, and you will work with a copy of that evidence so as to not taint the original. You want to be familiar with what makes evidence admissible in a court of law. This is U.S. law, of course. So the evidence has to be relevant to a fact in the case. It has to be material to the case at hand. The evidence must be competent or legally collected. So relevance means that a fact is more or less probable. It's more or less obviously true or false than it would be without the evidence. For the evidence to be competent, it means it's collected by traditional legal means. It's reliable, effectively. And evidence always has to be obtained by legal means. If you obtain evidence by illegal means, it's going to be inadmissible in court. But to prevail in court, your evidence has to be sufficient, convincing without question, leaving no doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, as you'll hear on television. So when do you begin collecting evidence? As soon as you discover an incident. You're going to collect evidence as much as possible because evidence can be used in subsequent legal action or finding an attacker identity, but we want to collect evidence before it disappears because some of our evidence is going to be volatile. But evidence can help us in determining the extent of damage. And the quicker we can understand the scope of our incident, the better. And that's where the order of volatility comes into play. So you want to collect the evidence from volatile sources first. So if a evidence disappears in a system reboot, power loss, or passage of time, that's volatile evidence. Here's an approximate order. You don't need to memorize this. This is more or less going to be common sense. What you want to remember for the exam is you collect the volatile evidence first. So evidence needs to be preserved in its original state. So that's where the forensic copy comes in, because the original data must be unaltered and pristine. It's a forensic copy. So that means for a disk, it's sector by sector copy of the disk, including the empty space and deleted space. It's all part of the image. And you can't, you'll sometimes store that on a worm drive, which is a write once, read many. So it's stored there and can't be altered. You could also put a write, protect, or a legal hold on some types of cloud storage. We talked about evidence storage later. I'm going to let that sit, but we kind of went through some common sense security controls for evidence storage a bit earlier. Now I want to revisit business continuity. This comes up a bit further a little later in the exam. And I want to talk about in particular here on 107, business impact analysis. So your BIA identifies your critical functions and systems that are essential to the organization. It also helps us identify maximum downtime limits for these systems and the components and the scenarios that can impact these systems, what our threats are. So the BIA is included again within the BCP process, and a good business impact analysis is going to contain cost benefit analysis, a calculation of our ROI on different actions. It's going to list the benefits of the decision alongside the cost. A CBA can be strictly quantitative, adding and subtracting benefits to determine whether a decision will be profitable. A thorough cost benefit analysis will consider some intangible benefits, those that we can't calculate directly, like protection to our reputation and so forth, potentially. A couple of important outputs of the business impact analysis is the recovery point objective, basically the age of data that must be recovered from backup storage, basically how far can we go back and still be okay? So max tolerable data loss between the last backup and the time of the disaster. And then the RTO, recovery time objective, which is the duration of time and a service level within which the process must be restored in order to avoid unacceptable consequences with that break in continuity. So SLAs between a company and its customers will influence the RPO and the RTO. So if we're promising our customers 5 nines of availability, our RPOs and RTOs are going to be really short. If our availability promise is just 99%, then we're going to be able to relax this a bit, because the higher of our availability promise to our customer, the more expensive our infrastructure and solutions on the back end are going to be. So a couple of other BCP related definitions you want for the exam. You've got mean time between failures, basically how long will a piece of infrastructure continue before it fails? Mean time to repair, how long it'll take to get a piece back online and repaired and back in service. Let's talk threat intelligence for a moment. So threat intelligence feeds are essentially a continuous stream of data about potential cyber threats, often not even human readable. They may be machine readable. Think of a threat intelligence feed like real-time news feed, but instead of news articles, it's delivering the latest updates on cyber threats that could be any sort of entity, advanced APTs, IP addresses, the latest threats. So what's included in a threat's going to vary by provider, but it can include indicators of compromise, your threat actors, your APTs, your emerging threats. A lot of these feeds are going to be machine readable in sticks and taxi format, which are generally consumable by a security information event management system. Others are going to be human readable feeds that you can read in email or dashboards. But these days, especially with AI and machine learning, you're going to have a lot of machine readable feeds that you can basically connect to your cloud security solutions of various sorts. And it's going to help us with early warning, improved detection, informed decision making, and ultimately faster remediation. So I mentioned taxi and sticks, so I wanted to call these out. So the automated indicator sharing is a CISSP capability. It basically enables real-time exchange of machine-readable cyber threat indicators. You can read about this out on CISSA.gov, but taxi defines how real-time threat information can be shared and how the messages are exchanged. And STIX, the structured threat information expression, is a common language for expressing the threat information itself. So TAXII is designed to support the transfer of the STIX information. So the detailed information comes in STIX format and it's transmitted on TAXII, and those formatted messages are securely transferred between systems. So STIX defines what a shared TAXII is, and TAXII is the how. STIX formatted messages are securely transferred between systems. So just remember, STIX defines what, and the TAXII is the how. And your SIEM solutions, your next-gen firewalls, your intrusion detection and preventions, many of these solutions these days are going to ingest threat intelligence feeds. All right. Somebody mentioned least privilege and need to know. I don't know if you're still with me. Call yourself out if you are. You wanted to know the difference between least privilege and need to know. So when we're limiting access and damage, delegation of duties is a security principle where we ensure that no single person can control all the elements of a critical function. So basically, it reduces the likelihood of collusion amongst employees because there's not one person that can carry out one task and one person that can carry out another. We have multiple people that have to be involved. And we can add in another policy to help us here, like job rotation or mandatory vacation, where segregation of duties is shared amongst multiple people. So we're swapping different people in, which further reduces our risk of collusion because we're changing in people. And when you're changing people in and out through job rotation and mandatory vacations, you can spot patterns of bad behavior based on who's in the mix. All right, least privilege and need to know. Stick with me here, Fahim. So least privilege is where we give a subject only those privileges necessary to complete their job-related tasks. Now, need to know goes a step further. So let me give you an example of least privilege. So I have a low-level government employee in the CIA. I don't give him access to top secret information. He just gets secret level access, let's say. But I'm not going to give him just carte blanche secret level access. I perhaps apply another control, need to know. I'm going to give him secret level access, but only on the investigations in which he is involved. So I will share with him information on a need to know basis, limiting him access at the secret level to only those job duties related to the investigation I have him on. Does that make sense? That example. It's basically going further than least privilege. It's locking him down to just what he needs for his job. And this can prevent, when we put least privilege in place, even if it doesn't stop an incident, it can certainly limit the scope of the incident or the data theft. A need to know is going to minimize the risk of data leak, and it's also going to increase accountability because you don't have access to that data unless you need to know. So let's move on to number 10. This is a big one, and I'm not going to go all the way through this. I cover this in the video series. My best coverage of this, my latest coverage of this, is in the book. If you don't have the book and you want to read my good coverage of incident management, I have a write-up in PDF format that I will share with you in the follow-up email. I've made a note of that, but I've basically written out incident management, all the terminology you need, and the process that you will see on the exam. So what I've laid out here, you'll see the NIST incident management process at the bottom, which is laid out in their special publication 800-61. You see the SANS incident management, but what you'll find in the official study guide, what you'll find on the CISSP exam is up here in this 7-step process. That's what you're going to see on the exam. You want to be familiar with not only the phases of this process, but the activities throughout this process, including where an incident is declared, back here in the detection phase, incidentally. So we could talk for an hour about this. I'm going to give you a PDF that covers the key facts that you need to know. It's covered in the PDF. If you've got the book, you've already got that plus. All right, I want to move on to number 111. You're going to be expected to be knowledgeable about types of firewalls, and I pulled a reference table from the book that I hope you'll find helpful. So a web application firewall is the most common type of firewall I encounter today. So it protects web applications from common threats, the threats that you will see in the OWASP top 10 list. Threats like cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, SQL injection. In fact, most of your WAFs out there today, your web app firewalls, will support the uploading of OWASP core rule sets. So OWASP has created sort of standardized agnostic rule sets that WAFs in your major cloud service providers can ingest. Some come pre-configured even, and you can pick the version. Now, next-gen firewalls, NGFW for short. These are deep packet inspection firewalls. They move beyond protocol inspection. They're going all the way into application level inspection. They may have intrusion prevention. They generally bring intelligence from outside the firewall, meaning they are connected to threat intelligence sources of one sort or another. Maybe a threat intelligence feed, maybe machine learning on the back end that's feeding intelligence specific to that provider. Certainly Microsoft, Amazon and Google all have their own custom threat intelligence they're injecting into their services. Deep packet inspection firewalls inspects and filters the header and the payload. It can detect protocol noncompliance, spam, viruses, and intrusions. Now, UTM, Unified Threat Management, this will typically include many functions, probably intrusion detection, even prevention. It'll often be an SSL proxy, web filtering, quality of service, natting, VPN, antivirus. So as a result, you'll see these as a multifunction device that's commonly used in smaller organizations where they don't have lots of dedicated staff. That's where you're going to see a UTM. So on the exam, if you see some question around, putting these types of functionalities in place in a small business, UTM is going to be a good answer. All right. I'm not going to sit here and cover every firewall because we'd be here for another hour. Here's a list of the firewall types that I cover in various places and the OSI layers that they operate on more or less. You're going to want to be familiar with these for exam day. You don't need to be an expert on any of them. You need to understand basically what they do. All right. I'm going to lay these all out. So IDS versus IPS. So intrusion detection versus intrusion prevention. So IDS can respond passively by detecting an issue, by detecting a threat and logging or notifying, but not changing the environment necessarily, right? So an IPS, on the other hand, is going to be placed in line with the traffic, and it includes the ability to block the traffic before it reaches the target. So the IPS is going to be proactive. It also needs to be placed in line if it's going to be the most effective. And then I want to look at host-based versus network-based IDS. You could see these come up as well. So host-based intrusion detection can basically monitor activity on a single system. And the drawback with host-based is it's often installed like on an existing server, on a Linux or a Windows server that's doing something else. So a lot of times the attacker can find that process that's running the IDS on the host and disable it more easily. So network-based intrusion detection can monitor activity on the network. It's not as visible to the attackers, so they're not necessarily going to know. So your network-based intrusion detection and prevention are basically at the network level. They're typically in hardware form. They're going to analyze the header and the payload. They're looking for known events, and when they find something, they're going to log something. If it's detection, if it's intrusion prevention, they're going to actively reject it. So that's the difference. Intrusion detection detects it but doesn't stop it. Intrusion prevention stops it. So network is going to be typically dedicated hardware, more expensive, but more difficult for the attackers to detect. Now, there are a couple of operations on the network side that you want to be familiar with. So there's inline or in-band network-based IDPS. It's where we put it on or near a firewall as an additional layer of security. So traffic is flowing through something. Now, passive is out of band, so the traffic doesn't flow directly through the device. You have sensors or collectors that forward this. That's going to be typically, that's going to be more often in an intrusion detection scenario. And then you've got a couple of different types of behavior that may come up here. So an IDS can be behavior-based or what's called heuristic or anomaly-based. This is where it creates a baseline of activity to identify normal, and then it measures performance against the baseline to identify abnormal. So there's going to be some smarts in there. It can detect previously unknown attack methods. And then you've got signature-based or what's called knowledge-based. It's using predefined patterns to detect known threats. So these are only going to be effective against known attacks, but your host-based and network-based IDS and IPS can both be knowledge-based, behavior-based, or a combination of both, ideally. All right, I want to talk to you about number 113 here, which is SIM and SOAR. So Security Information Event Management and Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response. So we didn't see this newly added to the syllabus, but what we saw is SOAR was moved around in the syllabus to be right next to SIM because these two go hand in hand. So your SIM is a system that collects your logs from many systems in your network, aggregates those logs into a central source, and then provides real-time monitoring, traffic analysis, and notification of potential attacks. SOAR is basically centralized alert response automation with a specific runbook or playbook. And the response might be fully automated, or it could be like semi-automated where you have to click it to kick off the response. These capabilities are commonly delivered together in a single solution. The one that I work with most frequently is called Microsoft Sentinel. It's Microsoft's SIM and SOAR solution. And these SIM and SOAR solutions, SIMs often use AI, machine learning, threat intelligence, all the above for improving their identification of threats and attacks and facilitating faster response. But at the end of the day, SIM and SOAR are really dealing with a problem, and that is that there are more potential threats in our environment than we have time to track. And SIM and SOAR basically deal with the fact that they are faster than humans in identifying and responding to true incidents. When I wake up and look at Sentinel in the morning, I see dozens of things that I didn't have to go find. It's going to reduce mean time to detection, and it's going to accelerate my response. It's going to use playbooks that define the incident and the action we take. And the capabilities are going to vary by vendor, but here's the point. Okay, your SIM is going to collect logs from all the different sources and bring them in. Excuse my Mac there, it's messed up the CASB. So we can bring in logs from our identity platforms, our endpoint, our database, our IaaS, our CASB, syslogs from our network and our Linux. And your SOAR solutions, you've got the playbook, which is a document or checklist that defines how to verify an incident. The runbook is that automated SOAR implementation of that playbook. But at the end of the day, remember this, your logs are worthless unless you do something with that data. You have to review them, identify the activity that's unauthorized or compromising. That's where the SIM comes into place. It centralizes the logs. It generally normalizes the data from the many different sources into a single format so you can query across those all at once, because then I can detect the full scope of the incident no matter where it was in my environment. And that's the magic of the SIM. It's going to centralize and aggregate those logs and normalize them. So I can then do this. I can have the data from all those sources, but then it's going to give me visibility across those so I can run one query and spot the malicious activity across my data, my apps, my identities, my endpoints, my infrastructure. And when I put SIM and SOAR together, all that log data allows me to implement complex response automation for faster response. Patch management is something you need to know for the exam. I threw this up here. This is covered in the longer course. What I would say to remember about patch management is good patch management can prevent zero-day threats. If I get everything patched in a timely way, I can close vulnerabilities that might have been recently discovered. All right. Let me get Siri to stop talking there. Pardon me. Recovery sites. So we see disaster recovery and testing come up. So we're on number 115. I'm going to stop at 120, but I wanted to give you the full treatment here. So 3 primary types of recovery sites. I cover about half a dozen types in the full course, but I wanted to cover the 3 most important with you here, and that's hot, warm, and cold. So the cold site is essentially just data center space, power, and network connectivity that's ready for us to come in there and do something. So to recover from a disaster, we've got to come in and do the work to, basically set up our hardware, our applications, etc. So the cost is going to be relatively low, but the effort to recover is going to be high. So we can go to a middle ground, a warm site, which allows us to pre-install our hardware and configure our bandwidth needs. So we've got some of our recovery already in place. Some of our infrastructure is ready to roll. But if a disaster strikes, we've got to go in there, load our software and our data, and get things back online. So it's going to be medium cost, medium effort, more or less. And certainly one can talk about variations of hot, warm, and cold. I'm giving you kind of exam level focus here, what you need for game day. A hot site, this is a proactive site. So you'll also hear a hot site referred to, or you'll maybe see a separate redundant site mentioned. So a hot site's going to be proactive, where we keep servers alive backup, running in the event of a disaster. You replicate your production environment into that data center. It allows for immediate cutover. Some exams are going to call that a redundant site, but it's more or less the same thing. So in the cloud, my hot site is going to be one where my failover is largely automatic, where I've got potentially regional or global load balancing and request routing in place. So this is really a must for mission critical sites. If our tolerance, if our RTO and RPOs are small, if our tolerance for recovery time is low, that's where hot comes into play. High cost, low effort. We're running more infrastructure all the time. Takes much less time to get it back. When you're thinking about geographic considerations, your failover site needs to be in a location where it's not affected by the same disaster. So your CSPs are typically your CSPs basically pick your regional pairs for you. And for example, the East Coast in a typical CSP uses the West Coast as its backup. 300 plus miles is typically the minimum. But distance is important. Selecting a location where we've got good data and recovery capability. We want offsite backup. So if a site is affected, we've got a copy of our data. If that's on physical tapes, or that's in the cloud or on disks, just having backups that we can get to is important. All right. There are 5 types of disaster recovery plan tests you need to be familiar with for game day. There's the read-through test, where you basically just distribute copies of the DR plans to the team, and they review them at their leisure. They tell you if there's anything missing. They just kind of review it and sanity check it to make sure everything they expect to be there is there. This is nice to make sure that your steps are up to date, and you can also identify gaps in your team when you go through the read through, because maybe you discover there's nobody to review a certain area of the plan. Now, the structured walkthrough, also called a tabletop exercise, in this one, the team comes together basically to role play a disaster scenario. Everybody gets in the conference room, and usually the scenario is only known to the moderator. In one organization I work with, the chief risk officer is that moderator, and they'll come in and throw the scenario down on the table, and everybody walks through the scenario. And the teams refer to the document. They discuss the appropriate responses to that particular type of disaster. So they're all either physically or virtually in one place going through. So far, though, these are just talk. Nobody's pushing any buttons. Nobody's testing anything. We're just making that the plans are actually complete, that they should, in theory, actually work. Then we can go on to tests that will do stuff. So a simulation test, similar to a structured walkthrough, except some of the response measures are tested on non-critical functions. We're not taking the business down, but we're actually doing some testing. Then we have parallel testing, where we might relocate personnel to an alternate recovery site and implement site activation procedures. Basically, the employees relocated to the site perform their DR responsibilities just as they would for an actual disaster. The way I've seen this play out is they'll send employees, maybe, they'll pretend like services are down at the main office, and they'll send a certain set of employees over to a branch office and say, go do your job, and you can't use the VPN back to the home office. And they'll make sure that the failover systems in the cloud work. And then you've got a full interruption test where we're actually shutting down operations at the primary site, shifting them to the recovery site. In mature organizations, you're doing full interruption testing on key services probably once a year. Not everybody's capable of doing it, but these three tests all involve some form of doing. That's the key differentiator there. There are two teams that are called out in the DR context in the official study resources from ISC Squared, the recovery team and the salvage team. The recovery team is used to get critical business functions running at the alternate site. The salvage team is used to return the primary site back to normal processing conditions. So the recovery team recovers business functions and gets us back in business in our DR configuration. The salvage team works on restoring us back to our original state. All right, my friends, we're down to the big finish here. We're going to move into Domain 8. And I'll tell you, in Domain 8, there's a lot of software-related information to cover that's not exactly exciting. I wanted to cover the areas where I could give you some meaningful guidance, okay? Things that are important, that are modern, that are relevant in a cloud world. So let's talk about development methodology. So the software development methodologies out there, the methods we'll use have expanded. So I'm going to cover these in number 117. We've got Agile, which was around last time. So this is a model for iterative development, which at its base comes down to using sprints. So you'll notice here that it mentions individuals and interactions over processes, working software over comprehensive documentation. So Agile is where we are exactly that. We're Agile. So if we jump in here and go in and go through our cycles, we have a development cycle called a sprint. A sprint's going to be 1 to 2 weeks long. 2 weeks tends to be the default. But your sprint is going to go through, we'll plan, we'll do our development work, we'll test it, and then at the end of the sprint, we have demo day on Friday. And on Friday, we'll demonstrate whatever we have working. And we'll take that working software, whatever state it's in, into our next sprint. We will carry that forward, and we're going to repeat the process. We're going to plan, develop, test, demonstrate, carry it forward until we are done with the project. Agile is very popular. The manifesto was written in 2001. It became a thing in the real world in 2006, fairly young as development methodologies go. You may see Scrum on the exam. This is an agile methodology that helps teams to work on more complex projects and complex products. It's primarily used by software development teams, but it provides a set of rules, practices, and roles to put agile principles into action where we need a little more structure. And then we have the scaled agile framework. I believe this is new on the 2024 exam. It's basically a set of organizational workflow patterns to implement agile at enterprise scale. So it has structured guidance on roles and responsibilities. It helps us scale out agile to support multiple teams, large numbers of teams. They basically took 3 primary bodies of knowledge, agile, lean, and systems thinking, and developed SAFe, scaled agile. But it builds on several aspects. The most important thing to remember is scaled agile framework doesn't replace agile. It just makes it adds layers to make it work in large, complex environments. Now let's go old school. You're almost certainly going to see waterfall mentioned on the exam. It's a 7-stage process that allows a return to a previous stage for corrections, but only one phase back. What you want to know about waterfall is it's planning heavy. It's used in critical projects. It's often used in critical infrastructure projects where you must have very heavy planning cycles. Like if you're planning a dam, building a dam on a river, That's a heavy infrastructure project. So like waterworks, public utilities, nuclear facilities, waterfall would be a great methodology. The spiral model may come up. Now, the spiral model allows for multiple iterations of a waterfall style process. It's known as a meta model, but basically it uh, results in a new prototype in each loop. So it's kind of waterfall with iterations, so to speak. So it's iterative. So in that sense, you might say, well, geez, that sounds like agile because agile is iterative. Well, make no mistake, spiral was around ages before agile was a thing. They just happened to share the iterations in common. Number 118, we're getting close, my friends. Maturity models, which help organizations improve maturity and quality of their software processes. Um, there are a handful that you're going to need to know for the exam. These three in particular. You need the capability maturity model, which has 5 levels of maturity, resulting in what is ultimately the optimize, where you're basically continuously developing your process with feedback loops. This can be abbreviated 3 different ways. I've called these out here because you might see the abbreviation in any one of those forms on the exam. But at the optimized level, that's where we have continuous integration and deployment. We have CI/CD that's so common in DevOps and DevSecOps. This one was created at Carnegie Mellon. There's the ideal model, which has basically a 5-phase process, which it implements many of the CMM attributes. It's similar in that respect. And then there's SAM, the Software Assurance Maturity Model. This is an open source project maintained by OWASP. So basically laying out what looks more like uh, a logical process from governance at the very beginning down through design, implementation, verification, and operation. So basically going through the life cycle of a solution, so to speak. So you want to be familiar with those 3. 119 is change management. So change management, remember, effective patching reduces exposure to 0-day threats, and patch management is part of it, should be attached to change management in that when we're deploying patches, we should notify the change, the CAB, the change approval board, so they have awareness of what we're doing because patching is changing the environment. All right. Now there's a new type of testing. So the last one, number 120, the big finish here. The last, I want to talk about testing, which comes up in the DevOps and DevSecOps cycles, where we're going to be testing our software throughout our development process. So we have static application security testing. This appeared in the 2021 exam. This is where the tester has access to the underlying framework, design, and implementation. They have access to the source code. Okay, that's a defining characteristic of static application security testing. Dynamic application security testing executes the application. It's evaluating the application as it is running. It does not require source code access. So sometimes it's said that static application security testing tests inside out, and dynamic testing tests from the outside in. New in the 2024 exam is interactive application security testing. It analyzes code for vulnerabilities while it is being used. It focuses on real-time reporting and optimized testing and analysis processes. So unlike static and dynamic testing, IAST analyzes the internal functions of the application while it's running. So it's finding code level, function level problems. It's really implementing the best of both worlds. And it's often built into our CI/CD automated release testing. So in a cloud, deployment in a cloud DevOps methodology where I'm, using source codes and CI pipelines, IaaS is going to be very common. You'll also want to know white box and black box testing. So kind of like black box and white box pen testing, one has full knowledge of the system, the other little or no knowledge. No source code required for black box. So one is full knowledge, the other is zero knowledge. New in 2024, software composition analysis. This is used to track the components of a software package or application. This is going to be especially important for open source software components, making sure we have the latest component, the component is secure. Because often your open source components are using reusable code libraries, so we have to know that what we are working with is secure. It's generally going to be automated, and it's going to combine application security with patch management of a source. But the SCA tools are going to identify vulnerabilities in these systems, ensuring we have the latest versions in use, and all that can feed into our SBOM, our software bill of materials. All right, my friends, we're just a touch before 9 o'clock. Those are your 20 bonus important items for the exam. So I'll wrap up this recording in the next few hours. I'm going to send you links to all of those resources I promised. It will probably be early morning my time, so give me just a few hours. And if you have questions, I will send you a link, and I'm going to put the link right here for those of you if you want to start proactively. I think I shared this earlier, but that's the link to my forum. If you have questions for me, hit me up there. It's the most reliable place to get to me, and I'm always happy to hear anything where you need clarification. I appreciate all your time. This was quite a haul. I appreciate all the time you invested. I'll be back to you in a few hours. Good luck on the exam. Hit me up anytime you need help. Take care.